Chapter 31. Phoebe's Petition. The division between Lady Audley and her stepdaughter had not become any narrower in the 2 months which had elapsed since the pleasant Christmas holiday time had been kept at Audley Court. There was no open warfare between the two women; there was only an armed neutrality, broken every now and then by brief feminine skirmishes and transient wordy tempests. I am sorry to say that Alicia would very much have preferred a hearty pitched battle to this silent and undemonstrative disunion, but it was not very easy to quarrel with my lady. She had soft answers for the turning away of wrath. She could smile bewitchingly at her stepdaughter's open petulance, and laugh merrily at the young lady's ill temper. Perhaps had she been less amiable, had she been more like Alicia in disposition, the two ladies might have expended their enmity in one tremendous quarrel, and might ever afterward have been affectionate and friendly. But Lucy Audley would not make war. She carried forward the sum of her dislike, and put it out at a steady rate of interest, until the breach between her stepdaughter and herself, widening a little every day, became a great gulf, utterly impassable by olive-branch-bearing doves from either side of the abyss. There can be no reconciliation where there is no open warfare. There must be a battle, a brave, boisterous battle, with pennants waving and cannon roaring, before there can be peaceful treaties and enthusiastic shaking of hands. Perhaps the union between France and England owes its greatest force to the recollection of Crécy and Waterloo, Navarino and Trafalgar. We have hated each other and licked each other and had it out, as the common phrase goes, and we can afford now to fall into each other's arms and vow eternal friendship and everlasting brotherhood. Let us hope that when northern Yankeedom has decimated and been decimated, blustering Jonathan may fling himself upon his southern brother's breast, forgiving and forgiven. Alicia Audley and her father's pretty wife had plenty of room for the comfortable indulgence of their dislike in the spacious old mansion. My lady had her own apartments, as we know, luxurious chambers, in which all conceivable elegancies had been gathered for the comfort of their occupant. Alicia had her own rooms in another part of the large house. She had her favorite mare, her Newfoundland dog, and her drawing materials, and she made herself tolerably happy. She was not very happy, this frank, generous-hearted girl, for it was scarcely possible that she could altogether be at ease in the constrained atmosphere of the court. Her father was changed. That dear father over whom she had once reigned supreme with the boundless authority of a spoiled child, had accepted another ruler and submitted to a new dynasty. Little by little my lady's petty power made itself felt in that narrow household, and Alicia saw her father gradually lured across the gulf that divided Lady Audley from her stepdaughter, until he stood at last quite upon the other side of the abyss, and looked coldly upon his only child across that widening chasm. Alicia felt that he was lost to her. My lady's beaming smiles, my lady's winning words, my lady's radiant glances and bewitching graces had done their work of enchantment, and Sir Michael had grown to look upon his daughter as a somewhat wilful and capricious young person, who had behaved with determined unkindness to the wife he loved. Poor Alicia saw all this, and bore her burden as well as she could. It seemed very hard to be a handsome, gray-eyed heiress, with dogs and horses and servants at her command, and yet to be so much alone in the world as to know of not one friendly ear into which she might pour her sorrows. "If Bob was good for anything, I could have told him how unhappy I am," thought Miss Audley. "But I may just as well tell Caesar my troubles for any consolation I should get from cousin Robert." Sir Michael Audley obeyed his pretty nurse, and went to bed a little after 9 o'clock upon this bleak March evening. Perhaps the baronet's bedroom was about the pleasantest retreat that an invalid could have chosen in such cold and cheerless weather. The dark green velvet curtains were drawn before the windows, and about the ponderous bed. The wood fire burned redly upon the broad hearth. The reading lamp was lighted upon a delicious little table close to Sir Michael's pillow, and a heap of magazines and newspapers had been arranged by my lady's own fair hands for the pleasure of the invalid. Lady Audley sat by the bedside for about 10 minutes, talking to her husband, talking very seriously, about this strange and awful question, Robert Audley's lunacy, but at the end of that time she rose and bade her husband good night. She lowered the green silk shade before the reading lamp, adjusting it carefully for the repose of the baronet's eyes. "I shall leave you, dear," she said. "If you can sleep, so much the better. If you wish to read, the books and papers are close to you. I will leave the doors between the rooms open, and I shall hear your voice if you call me." Lady Audley went through her dressing-room into the boudoir, where she had sat with her husband since dinner. Every evidence of womanly refinement was visible in the elegant chamber. My lady's piano was open, covered with scattered sheets of music and exquisitely bound collections of scenas and fantasias which no master need have disdained to study. My lady's easel stood near the window, bearing witness to my lady's artistic talent, in the shape of a water-colored sketch of the court and gardens. My lady's fairy-like embroideries of lace and muslin, rainbow-hued silks, and delicately tinted wools littered the luxurious apartment, while the looking-glasses, cunningly placed at angles and opposite corners by an artistic upholsterer, multiplied my lady's image, and in that image reflected the most beautiful object in the enchanted chamber. Amid all this lamplight, gilding, color, wealth, and beauty, Lucy Audley sat down on a low seat by the fire to think. If Mr. Holman Hunt could have peeped into the pretty boudoir, I think the picture would have been photographed upon his brain to be reproduced by and by upon a bishop's half-length for the glorification of the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. My lady, in that half-recumbent attitude, with her elbow resting on one knee, and her perfect chin supported by her hand, the rich folds of drapery falling away in long undulating lines from the exquisite outline of her figure, and the luminous rose-colored firelight enveloping her in a soft haze, only broken by the golden glitter of her yellow hair, beautiful in herself, but made bewilderingly beautiful by the gorgeous surroundings which adorn the shrine of her loveliness. Drinking cups of gold and ivory, chiseled by Benvenuto Cellini, cabinets of buhl and porcelain, bearing the cipher of Austrian Marie Antoinette, amid devices of rosebuds and true lovers' knots, birds and butterflies, cupidons and shepherdesses, goddesses, courtiers, cottagers, and milkmaids, statuettes of Parisian marble and biscuit china, gilded baskets of hothouse flowers, fantastical caskets of Indian filigree work, fragile teacups of turquoise china, adorned by medallion miniatures of Louis the Great and Louis the Well-Beloved, Louise de la Valliere, Athénée de Montespan, and Marie-Jeanne Gambard de Vaubernier, cabinet pictures and gilded mirrors, shimmering satin and diaphanous lace, all that gold can buy or art devise, had been gathered together for the beautification of this quiet chamber, in which my lady sat listening to the mourning of the shrill March wind, and the flapping of the ivy leaves against the casements, and looking into the red chasms in the burning coals. I should be preaching a very stale sermon, and harping upon a very familiar moral, if I were to seize this opportunity of declaiming against art and beauty, because my lady was more wretched in this elegant apartment than many a half-starved seamstress in her dreary garret. She was wretched by reason of a wound which lay too deep for the possibility of any solace from such plasters as wealth and luxury. But her wretchedness was of an abnormal nature, and I can see no occasion for seizing upon the fact of her misery as an argument in favor of poverty and discomfort as opposed to opulence. The Benvenuto Cellini carvings and the Sèvres porcelain could not give her happiness, because she had passed out of their region. She was no longer innocent, and the pleasure we take in art and loveliness being an innocent pleasure, had passed beyond her reach. 6 or 7 years before, she would have been happy in the possession of this little Aladdin's palace, but she had wandered out of the circle of careless, pleasure-seeking creatures. She had strayed far away into a desolate labyrinth of guilt and treachery, terror and crime, and all the treasures that had been collected for her could have given her no pleasure but one, the pleasure of flinging them into a heap beneath her feet, and trampling upon them, and destroying them in her cruel despair. There were some things that would have inspired her with an awful joy, a horrible rejoicing. If Robert Audley, her pitiless enemy, her unrelenting pursuer, had lain dead in the adjoining chamber, she would have exulted over his bier. What pleasures could have remained for Lucretia Borgia and Catherine de Medici when the dreadful boundary line between innocence and guilt was passed, and the lost creature stood upon the lonely outer side? Only horrible, vengeful joys and treacherous delights were left for these miserable women. With what disdainful bitterness they must have watched the frivolous vanities, the petty deceptions, the paltry sins of ordinary offenders. Perhaps they took a horrible pride in the enormity of their wickedness, in this divinity of hell, which made them greatest among sinful creatures. My lady, brooding by the fire in her lonely chamber, with her large clear blue eyes fixed upon the yawning gulfs of lurid crimson in the burning coals, may have thought of many things very far away from the terribly silent struggle in which she was engaged. She may have thought of long-ago years of childish innocence, childish follies and selfishness, of frivolous feminine sins that had weighed very lightly upon her conscience. Perhaps in that retrospective reverie she recalled that early time in which she had first looked in the glass and discovered that she was beautiful. that fatal early time in which she had first begun to look upon her loveliness as a right divine, a boundless possession which was to be a set-off against all girlish shortcomings, a counterbalance of every youthful sin. Did she remember the day in which that fairy dower of beauty had first taught her to be selfish and cruel, indifferent to the joys and sorrows of others, cold-hearted and capricious, greedy of admiration, exacting and tyrannical with that petty woman's tyranny which is the worst of despotism? Did she trace every sin of her life back to its true source? And did she discover that poisoned fountain in her own exaggerated estimate of the value of a pretty face? Surely, if her thoughts wandered so far along the backward current of her life, she must have repented in bitterness and despair of that first day in which the master passions of her life had become her rulers, and the three demons of vanity, selfishness, and ambition had joined hands and said, "This woman is our slave. Let us see what she will become under our guidance." How small those first youthful errors seemed as my lady looked back upon them in that long reverie by the lonely hearth. What small vanities, what petty cruelties, a triumph over a schoolfellow, a flirtation with the lover of a friend, an assertion of the right divine invested in blue eyes and shimmering golden-tinted hair. But how terribly that narrow pathway had widened out into the broad highroad of sin, and how swift the footsteps had become upon the now familiar way. My lady twisted her fingers in her loose amber curls, and made as if she would have torn them from her head. But even in that moment of mute despair the unyielding dominion of beauty asserted itself, and she released the poor tangled glitter of ringlets, leaving them to make a halo round her head in the dim firelight. "I was not wicked when I was young," she thought, as she stared gloomingly at the fire. "I was only thoughtless. I never did any harm, at least wilfully. Have I ever been really wicked, I wonder?" she mused. "My worst wickednesses have been the result of wild impulses, and not of deeply laid plots. I am not like the women I have read of, who have lain night after night in the horrible darkness and stillness, planning out treacherous deeds, and arranging every circumstance of an appointed crime. I wonder whether they suffered, those women, whether they ever suffered as—" Her thoughts wandered away into a weary maze of confusion. Suddenly she drew herself up with a proud, defiant gesture, and her eyes glittered with a light that was not entirely reflected from the fire. "You are mad, Mr. Robert Audley," she said. "You are mad, and your fancies are a madman's fancies. I know what madness is. I know its signs and tokens, and I say that you are mad." She put her hand to her head as if thinking of something which confused and bewildered her, and which she found it difficult to contemplate with calmness. "Dare I defy him?" she muttered. "Dare I? Dare I? Will he stop now that he has once gone so far? Will he stop for fear of me? Will he stop for fear of me when the thought of what his uncle must suffer has not stopped him? Will anything stop him but death?" She pronounced the last words in an awful whisper, and with her head bent forward, her eyes dilated, and her lips still parted as they had been parted in her utterance of that final word, death. She sat blankly staring at the fire. "I can't plot horrible things," she muttered presently. "My brain isn't strong enough, or I'm not wicked enough, or brave enough. If I met Robert Audley in those lonely gardens as I—" The current of her thoughts was interrupted by a cautious knocking at her door. She rose suddenly, startled by any sound in the stillness of her room. She rose and threw herself into a low chair near the fire. She flung her beautiful head back upon the soft cushions, and took a book from the table near her. Insignificant as this action was, it spoke very plainly. It spoke very plainly of ever-recurring fears, of fatal necessities for concealment, of a mind that in its silent agonies was ever alive to the importance of outward effect. It told more plainly than anything else could have told how complete an actress my lady had been made by the awful necessity of her life. The modest rap at the door was repeated. "Come in," cried Lady Audley in her liveliest tone. The door was opened with that respectful noiselessness peculiar to a well-bred servant, and a young woman, plainly dressed, and carrying some of the cold March winds in the fold of her garments, crossed the threshold of the apartment, and lingered near the door, waiting permission to approach the inner regions of my lady's retreat. It was Phoebe Marks, the pale-faced wife of the Mount Stanning innkeeper. "I beg pardon, my lady, for intruding without leave," she said, "but I thought I might venture to come straight up without waiting for permission." "Yes, yes, Phoebe, to be sure. Take off your bonnet, you wretched, cold-looking creature, and come sit down here." Lady Audley pointed to the low ottoman upon which she had herself been seated a few minutes before. The lady's maid had often sat upon it, listening to her mistress's prattle in the old days, when she had been my lady's chief companion and confidant. "Sit down here, Phoebe," Lady Audley repeated. "Sit down here and talk to me. I am very glad you came here tonight. I was horribly lonely in this dreary place." My lady shivered and looked round at the bright collection of bric-a-brac, as if the Sèvres and bronze, the buhl and ormolu, had been the mouldering adornments of some ruined castle. The dreary wretchedness of her thoughts had communicated itself to every object about her, and all outer things took their color from that weary inner life, which held its slow course of secret anguish in her breast. She had spoken the entire truth in saying that she was glad of her lady's maid's visit. Her frivolous nature clung to this weak shelter in the hour of her fear and suffering. There were sympathies between her and this girl, who was like herself, inwardly as well as outwardly. Like herself, selfish, and cold and cruel, eager for her own advancement, and greedy of opulence and elegance, angry with the lot that had been cast her, and weary of dull dependence. My lady hated Alicia for her frank, passionate, generous, daring nature. She hated her stepdaughter, and clung to this pale-faced, pale-haired girl, whom she thought neither better nor worse than herself. Phoebe Marks obeyed her late mistress's commands, and took off her bonnet before seating herself on the ottoman at Lady Audley's feet. Her smooth bands of light hair were unruffled by the March winds. Her trimly made drab dress and linen collar were as neatly arranged as they could have been had she only that moment completed her toilet. "Sir Michael is better, I hope, my lady," she said. "Yes, Phoebe, much better. He is asleep. You may close that door," added Lady Audley, with a motion of her head toward the door of communication between the rooms, which had been left open. Mrs. Marks obeyed submissively, and then returned to her seat. "I am very, very unhappy, Phoebe," my lady said fretfully. "Wretchedly miserable." "About the secret?" asked Mrs. Marks in a half-whisper. My lady did not notice that question. She resumed in the same complaining tone. She was glad to be able to complain even to this lady's maid. She had brooded over her fears, and had suffered in secret so long, that it was an inexpressible relief to her to bemoan her fate aloud. "I am cruelly persecuted and harassed, Phoebe Marks," she said. "I am pursued and tormented by a man whom I never injured, whom I have never wished to injure. I am never suffered to rest by this relentless tormentor, and—" She paused, staring at the fire again, as she had done in her loneliness. Lost again in the dark intricacies of thought which wandered hither and thither in a dreadful chaos of terrified bewilderments, she could not come to any fixed conclusion. Phoebe Marks watched my lady's face, looking upward at her late mistress with pale, anxious eyes, that only relaxed their watchfulness when Lady Audley's glance met that of her companion. "I think I know whom you mean, my lady," said the innkeeper's wife after a pause. "I think I know who it is who is so cruel to you." "Oh, of course," answered my lady bitterly. "My secrets are everybody's secrets. You know all about it, no doubt." "The person is a gentleman, is he not, my lady?" "Yes." "A gentleman who came to the Castle Inn 2 months ago, when I warned you—" "Yes, yes," answered my lady impatiently. "I thought so. The same gentleman is at our place tonight, my lady." Lady Audley started up from her chair, started up as if she would have done something desperate in her despairing fury, but she sank back again with a weary, querulous sigh. What warfare could such a feeble creature wage against her fate? What could she do but wind like a hunted hare till she found her way back to the starting point of the cruel chase, to be there trampled down by her pursuers? "At the Castle Inn!" she cried. "I might have known as much. He has gone there to wring my secrets from your husband. Fool!" she exclaimed, suddenly turning upon Phoebe Marks in a transport of anger. "Do you want to destroy me that you have left those 2 men together?" Mrs. Marks clasped her hands piteously. "I didn't come away of my own free will, my lady," she said. "No one could have been more unwilling to leave the house than I was this night. I was sent here." "Who sent you here?" "Luke, my lady. You can't tell how hard he can be upon me if I go against him." "Why did he send you?" The innkeeper's wife dropped her eyelids under Lady Audley's angry glances, and hesitated confusedly before she answered this question. "Indeed, my lady," she stammered, "I didn't want to come. I told Luke that it was too bad for us to worry you, first asking this favor, and then asking that, and never leaving you alone for a month together, but he bore me down with his loud, blustering talk, and he made me come." Yes, yes, cried Lady Audley impatiently. I know that. I want to know why you have come. Why, you know, my lady, answered Phoebe half reluctantly, Luke is very extravagant, and all I can say to him, I can't get him to be careful or steady. He's not sober, and when he's drinking with a lot of rough countrymen, and drinking perhaps even more than they do, it isn't likely that his head can be very clear for accounts. If it hadn't been for me, we should have been ruined before this, and hard as I've tried, I haven't been able to keep the ruin off. You remember giving me the money for the brewer's bill, my lady? Yes, I remember very well, answered Lucy Audley, with a bitter laugh, for I wanted that money to pay my own bills. I know you did, my lady, and it was very, very hard for me to have to come and ask you for it, after all that we'd received from you before. But that isn't the worst. When Luke sent me down here to beg the favor of that help, he never told me that the Christmas rent was still owing. But it was, my lady, and it's owing now, and there's a bailiff in the house tonight, and we're to be sold up tomorrow unless I pay your rent, I suppose, cried Lucy Audley. I might have guessed what was coming. Indeed, my lady, I wouldn't have asked it, sobbed Phoebe Marks, but he made me come. Yes, answered my lady bitterly, he made you come, and he will make you come whenever he pleases, and whenever he wants money for the gratification of his low vices, and you and he are my pensioners as long as I live, or as long as I have any money to give. For I suppose when my purse is empty and my credit ruined, you and your husband will turn upon me and sell me to the highest bidder. Do you know, Phoebe Marks, that my jewel case has been half empty to meet your claims? Did you know that my pin money, which I thought such a princely allowance when my marriage settlement was made, and when I was a poor governess at Mr. Dawson's, heaven help me, my pin money has been overdrawn half a year to satisfy your demands? What can I do to appease you? Shall I sell my Marie Antoinette cabinet, or my Pompadour china, Leroy's and Benson's ormolu clocks, or my Gobelin tapestry chairs and ottomans? How shall I satisfy you next? Oh, my lady, cried Phoebe piteously, don't be so cruel to me. You know that it isn't I who want to impose upon you. I know nothing, exclaimed Lady Audley, except that I am the most miserable of women. Let me think, she cried, silencing Phoebe's consolatory murmurs with an imperious gesture. Hold your tongue, girl, and let me think of this business if I can. She put her hands to her forehead, clasping her slender fingers across her brow, as if she would have controlled the action of her brain by their convulsive pressure. Robert Audley is with your husband, she said slowly, speaking to herself rather than to her companion. These two men are together, and there are bailiffs in the house, and your brutal husband is no doubt brutally drunk by this time, and brutally obstinate and ferocious in his drunkenness. If I refuse to pay this money, his ferocity will be multiplied by 100-fold. There's little use in discussing that matter. The money must be paid. But if you do pay it, said Phoebe earnestly, I hope you will impress upon Luke that it is the last money you will ever give him while he stops in that house. Why? asked Lady Audley, letting her hands fall on her lap, and looking inquiringly at Mrs. Marks. Because I want Luke to leave the castle. But why do you want him to leave? Oh, for ever so many reasons, my lady, answered Phoebe. He's not fit to be the landlord of a public house. I didn't know that when I married him, or I would have gone against the business, and tried to persuade him to take to the farming line. Not that I suppose he'd have given up his own fancy either, for he's obstinate enough, as you know, my lady. He's not fit for his present business. He's scarcely ever sober after dark, and when he's drunk he gets almost wild, and doesn't seem to know what he does. We've had 2 or 3 narrow escapes with him already. Narrow escapes? Repeated Lady Audley. What do you mean? Why, we've run the risk of being burnt in our beds through his carelessness. Burnt in your beds through his carelessness? Why, how was that? asked my lady, rather listlessly. She was too selfish and too deeply absorbed in her own troubles to take much interest in any danger which had befallen her sometime lady's maid. You know what a queer old place the castle is, my lady, all tumble-down woodwork and rotten rafters and such like. The Chelmsford Insurance Company won't insure it, for they say if the place did happen to catch fire of a windy night, it would blaze away like so much tinder, and nothing in the world could save it. Well, Luke knows this, and the landlord has warned him of it time and often, for he lives close against us, and he keeps a pretty sharp eye upon all my husband's goings-on. But when Luke's tipsy he doesn't know what he's about, and only a week ago he left a candle burning in one of the outhouses, and the flame caught one of the rafters of the sloping roof, and if it hadn't been for me finding it out when I went round the house the last thing, we should have all been burnt to death, perhaps. And that's the third time the same kind of thing has happened in the 6 months we've had the place, and you can't wonder that I'm frightened, can you, my lady?" My lady had not wondered. She had not thought about the business at all. She had scarcely listened to these commonplace details. Why should she care for this low-born waiting-woman's perils and troubles? Had she not her own terrors, her own soul-absorbing perplexities to usurp every thought of which her brain was capable? She did not make any remark upon that which poor Phoebe just told her. She scarcely comprehended what had been said, until some moments after the girl had finished speaking, when the words assumed their full meaning, as some words do after they have been heard without being heeded. "Burnt in your beds," said the young lady at last. "It would have been a good thing for me if that precious creature, your husband, had been burnt in his bed before tonight." A vivid picture had flashed upon her as she spoke, the picture of that frail wooden tenement, the Castle Inn, reduced to a roofless chaos of lath and plaster, vomiting flames from its black mouth, and spitting blazing sparks upward toward the cold night sky. She gave a weary sigh as she dismissed this image from her restless brain. She would be no better off even if this enemy should be forever silenced. She had another and far more dangerous foe, a foe who was not to be bribed or bought off, though she had been as rich as an empress. "I'll give you the money to send this bailiff away," my lady said after a pause. "I must give you the last sovereign in my purse, but what of that? You know as well as I do that I dare not refuse you." Lady Audley rose and took the lighted lamp from her writing-table. "The money is in my dressing-room," she said. "I will go and fetch it." "Oh, my lady," exclaimed Phoebe suddenly, "I forgot something. I was in such a way about this business that I quite forgot it." "Quite forgot what?" "A letter that was given me to bring you, my lady, just before I left home." "What letter?" "A letter from Mr. Audley. He heard my husband mention that I was coming down here, and he asked me to carry this letter." Lady Audley set the lamp down upon the table nearest to her, and held out her hand to receive the letter. Phoebe Marks could scarcely fail to observe that the little jeweled hand shook like a leaf. "Give it me, give it me," she cried. "Let me see what more he has to say." Lady Audley almost snatched the letter from Phoebe's hand in her wild impatience. She tore open the envelope and flung it from her. She could scarcely unfold the sheet of notepaper in her eager excitement. The letter was very brief. It contained only these words: "Should Mrs. George Talboys really have survived the date of her supposed death, as recorded in the public prints, and upon the tombstone in the Ventnor churchyard, and should she exist in the person of the lady suspected and accused by the writer of this, there can be no great difficulty in finding some one able and willing to identify her. Mrs. Barcombe, the owner of North Cottages, Wildernsea, would no doubt consent to throw some light upon this matter, either to dispel a delusion or to confirm a suspicion. Robert Audley, March 3rd, 1859, The Castle Inn, Mount Stanning." Chapter 32. The Red Light in the Sky. My lady crushed the letter fiercely in her hand, and flung it from her into the flames. "If he stood before me now, and I could kill him," she muttered in a strange inward whisper, "I would do it. I would do it." She snatched up the lamp, and rushed into the adjoining room. She shut the door behind her. She could not endure any witness of her horrible despair. She could endure nothing, neither herself nor her surroundings. The door between my lady's dressing-room and the bedchamber in which Sir Michael lay had been left open. The baronet slept peacefully, his noble face plainly visible in the subdued lamplight. His breathing was low and regular, his lips curved into a half-smile, a smile of tender happiness which he often wore when he looked at his beautiful wife, the smile of an all-indulgent father who looks admiringly at his favorite child. Some touch of womanly feeling, some sentiment of compassion softened Lady Audley's glance as it fell upon that noble, reposing figure. For a moment the horrible egotism of her own misery yielded to her pitying tenderness for another. It was perhaps only a semi-selfish tenderness after all, in which pity for herself was as powerful as pity for her husband, but for once in a way her thoughts ran out of the narrow groove of her own terrors and her own troubles to dwell with prophetic grief upon the coming sorrows of another. "If they make him believe, how wretched he will be," she thought. But intermingled with that thought there was another. There was the thought of her lovely face, her bewitching manner, her arch smile, her low musical laugh, which was like a peal of silvery bells ringing across a broad expanse of flat meadowland and a rippling river in the misty summer evening. She thought of all these things with a transient thrill of triumph, which was stronger even than her terror. If Sir Michael Audley lived to be 100 years old, whatever he might learn to believe of her, however he might grow to despise her, would he ever be able to disassociate her from these attributes? No, 1,000 times no. To the last hour of his life his memory would present her to him invested with the loveliness that had first won his enthusiastic admiration, his devoted affection. Her worst enemies could not rob her of that fairy dower which had been so fatal in its influence upon her frivolous mind. She paced up and down the dressing-room in the silvery lamplight, pondering upon the strange letter which she had received from Robert Audley. She walked backward and forward in that monotonous wandering for some time before she was able to steady her thoughts, before she was able to bring the scattered forces of her narrow intellect to bear upon the one all-important subject of the threat contained in the barrister's letter. "He will do it," she said between her set teeth. "He will do it, unless I get him into a lunatic asylum first, or unless—" She did not finish the thought in words. She did not even think out the sentence, but some new and unnatural impulse in her heart seemed to beat each syllable against her breast. The thought was this: "He will do it, unless some strange calamity befalls him, and silences him forever." The red blood flashed up into my lady's face with as sudden and transient a blaze as the flickering flame of a fire, and died as suddenly away, leaving her more pale than winter snow. Her hands, which had before been locked convulsively together, fell apart and dropped heavily at her sides. She stopped in her rapid pacing to and fro, stopped as Lot's wife may have stopped, after that fatal backward glance at the perishing city, with every pulse slackening, with every drop of blood congealing in her veins, in the terrible process that was to transform her from a woman into a statue. Lady Audley stood still for about 5 minutes in that strangely statuesque attitude, her head erect, her eyes staring straight before her, staring far beyond the narrow boundary of her chamber wall into dark distances of peril and horror. But by and by she started from that rigid attitude almost as abruptly as she had fallen into it. She roused herself from that semi-lethargy. She walked rapidly to her dressing-table, and seating herself before it, pushed away the litter of golden-stoppered bottles and delicate china essence-boxes, and looked at her reflection in the large oval glass. She was very pale, but there was no other trace of agitation visible in her girlish face. The lines of her exquisitely molded lips were so beautiful that it was only a very close observer who could have perceived a certain rigidity that was unusual to them. She saw this herself, and tried to smile away that statue-like immobility, but tonight the rosy lips refused to obey her. They were firmly locked, and were no longer the slaves of her will and pleasure. All the latent forces of her character concentrated themselves in this one feature. She might command her eyes, but she could not control the muscles of her mouth. She rose from before her dressing-table, and took a dark velvet cloak and bonnet from the recesses of her wardrobe, and dressed herself for walking. The little ormolu clock on the chimney-piece struck the 11:15, while Lady Audley was employed in this manner. 5 minutes afterward she re-entered the room in which she had left Phoebe Marks. The innkeeper's wife was sitting before the low fender very much in the same attitude as that in which her late mistress had brooded over that lonely hearth earlier in the evening. Phoebe had replenished the fire, and had reassumed her bonnet and shawl. She was anxious to get home to that brutal husband, who was only too apt to fall into some mischief in her absence. She looked up as Lady Audley entered the room, and uttered an exclamation of surprise at seeing her late mistress in a walking costume. "My lady," she cried, "you are not going out tonight?" "Yes, I am, Phoebe," Lady Audley answered very quietly. "I am going to Mount Stanning with you to see this bailiff, and to pay and dismiss him myself." "But, my lady, you forget what the time is. You can't go out at such an hour." Lady Audley did not answer. She stood with her finger resting lightly upon the handle of the bell, meditating quietly. "The stables are always locked, and the men in bed by 10 o'clock," she murmured, "when we are at home. It will make a terrible hubbub to get a carriage ready, but yet I dare say one of the servants could manage the matter quietly for me." "But why should you go tonight, my lady?" cried Phoebe Marks. "Tomorrow will do quite as well. A week hence will do as well. Our landlord would take the man away if he had your promise to settle the debt." Lady Audley took no notice of this interruption. She went hastily into the dressing-room and flung off her bonnet and cloak, and then returned to the boudoir in her simple dinner costume, with her curls brushed carelessly away from her face. "Now, Phoebe Marks, listen to me," she said, grasping her confidante's wrist, and speaking in a low, earnest voice, but with a certain imperious air that challenged contradiction and commanded obedience. "Listen to me, Phoebe," she repeated. "I am going to the Castle Inn tonight. Whether it is early or late is of very little consequence to me. I have set my mind upon going, and I shall go. You have asked me why, and I have told you. I am going in order that I may pay this debt myself, and that I may see for myself that the money I give is applied to the purpose for which I give it. There is nothing out of the common course of life in my doing this. I am going to do what other women in my position very often do. I am going to assist a favorite servant." "But it's getting on for 12 o'clock, my lady," pleaded Phoebe. Lady Audley frowned impatiently at this interruption. "If my going to your house to pay this man should be known," she continued, still retaining her hold of Phoebe's wrist, "I am ready to answer for my conduct. But I would rather that the business should be kept quiet. I think that I can leave this house without being seen by any living creature, if you will do as I tell you." "I will do anything you wish, my lady," answered Phoebe submissively. "Then you will wish me good night presently, when my maid comes into the room, and you will suffer her to show you out of the house. You will cross the courtyard, and wait for me in the avenue upon the other side of the archway. It may be half an hour before I am able to join you, for I must not leave my room till the servants have all gone to bed. But you may wait for me patiently, for come what may, I will join you." Lady Audley's face was no longer pale. An unnatural luster gleamed in her great blue eyes. She spoke with an unnatural rapidity. She had altogether the appearance and manner of a person who has yielded to the dominant influence of some overpowering excitement. Phoebe Marks stared at her late mistress in mute bewilderment. She began to fear that my lady was going mad. The bell which Lady Audley rang was answered by the smart lady's maid, who wore rose-colored ribbons and black silk gowns, and other adornments which were unknown to the humble people who sat below the salt in the good old days when servants wore linsey-woolsey. "I did not know that it was so late, Martin," said my lady, in that gentle tone which always won for her the willing service of her inferiors. "I have been talking with Mrs. Marks, and have let the time slip by me. I shan't want anything tonight, so you may go to bed when you please." "Thank you, my lady," answered the girl, who looked very sleepy, and had some difficulty in repressing a yawn even in her mistress's presence, for the Audley household usually kept very early hours. "I had better show Mrs. Marks out, my lady, hadn't I?" asked the maid, "before I go to bed?" "Oh, yes, to be sure. You can let Phoebe out. All the other servants have gone to bed, then, I suppose?" "Yes, my lady." Lady Audley laughed as she glanced at the timepiece. "We have been terrible dissipated up here, Phoebe," she said. "Good night. You may tell your husband that his rent shall be paid." "Thank you very much, my lady, and good night," murmured Phoebe as she backed out of the room, followed by the lady's maid. Lady Audley listened at the door, waiting till the muffled sounds of their footsteps died away in the octagon chamber and on the carpeted staircase. "Martin sleeps at the top of the house," she said, "half a mile away from this room. In 10 minutes I may safely make my escape." She went back into her dressing-room and put on her cloak and bonnet for the second time. The unnatural color still burnt like a flame in her cheeks. The unnatural light still glittered in her eyes. The excitement which she was under held her in so strong a spell that neither her mind nor her body seemed to have any consciousness of fatigue. However verbose I may be in my description of her feelings, I can never describe a tithe of her thoughts or her sufferings. She suffered agonies that would fill closely printed volumes, bulky with 1,000 pages, in that one horrible night. She underwent volumes of anguish and doubt and perplexity, sometimes repeating the same chapters of her torments over and over again, sometimes hurrying through 1,000 pages of her misery without one pause, without one moment of breathing time. She stood by the low fender in her boudoir, watching the minute hand of the clock, and waiting till it should be time for her to leave the house in safety. "I will wait 10 minutes," she said, "not a moment beyond, before I enter on my new peril." She listened to the wild roaring of the March wind, which seemed to have risen with the stillness and darkness of the night. The hand slowly made its inevitable way to the figures which told that 10 minutes were past. It was exactly 11:45 when my lady took her lamp in her hand and stole softly from the room. Her footfall was as light as that of some graceful wild animal, and there was no fear of that airy step awakening any echo upon the carpeted stone corridors and staircase. She did not pause until she reached the vestibule upon the ground floor. Several doors opened out of the vestibule, which was octagon like my lady's antechamber. One of these doors led into the library, and it was this door which Lady Audley opened softly and cautiously. To have attempted to leave the house secretly by any of the principal outlets would have been simple madness, for the housekeeper herself superintended the barricading of the great doors, back and front. The secrets of the bolts and bars and chains and bells which secured these doors, and provided for the safety of Sir Michael Audley's plate room, the door of which was lined with sheet iron, were known only to the servants who had to deal with them. But although all these precautions were taken with the principal entrances to the citadel, a wooden shutter and a slender iron bar, light enough to be lifted by a child, were considered sufficient safeguard for the half-glass door which opened out of the breakfast-room into the gravelled pathway and smooth turf in the courtyard. It was by this outlet that Lady Audley meant to make her escape. She could easily remove the bar and unfasten the shutter, and she might safely venture to leave the window ajar while she was absent. There was little fear of Sir Michael's awaking for some time, as he was a heavy sleeper in the early part of the night, and had slept more heavily than usual since his illness. Lady Audley crossed the library and opened the door of the breakfast-room which communicated with it. This latter apartment was one of the later additions to the court. It was a simple, cheerful chamber, with brightly papered walls and pretty maple furniture, and was more occupied by Alicia than anyone else. The paraphernalia of that young lady's favorite pursuits were scattered about the room: drawing materials, unfinished scraps of work, tangled skeins of silk, and all the other tokens of a careless damsel's presence, while Miss Audley's picture, a pretty crayon sketch of a rosy-faced hoyden in a riding habit and hat, hung over the quaint Wedgwood ornaments on the chimney-piece. My lady looked upon these familiar objects with scornful hatred flaming in her blue eyes. "How glad she will be if any disgrace befalls me," she thought. "How she will rejoice if I am driven out of this house." Lady Audley set the lamp upon a table near the fireplace and went to the window. She removed the iron bar and the light wooden shutter, and then opened the glass door. The March night was black and moonless, and a gust of wind blew in upon her as she opened the door, and filled the room with its chilly breath, extinguishing the lamp upon the table. "No matter," my lady muttered. "I could not have left it burning. I shall know how to find my way through the house when I come back. I have left all the doors ajar." She stepped quickly out upon the smooth gravel, and closed the glass door behind her. She was afraid lest that treacherous wind should blow to the door opening into the library, and thus betray her. She was in the quadrangle now, with that chill wind sweeping against her, and swirling her silken garments round her with a shrill rustling noise, like the whistling of a sharp breeze against the sails of a yacht. She crossed the quadrangle and looked back for a moment at the firelight gleaming between the rosy-tinted curtains in her boudoir, and the dim gleam of the lamp through the mullioned windows in the room where Sir Michael Audley lay asleep. "I feel as if I were running away," she thought. "I feel as if I were running away secretly in the dead of night, to lose myself and be forgotten. Perhaps it would be wiser in me to run away, to take this man's warning, and escape out of his power forever. If I were to run away and disappear as George Talboys disappeared. But where could I go? What would become of me? I have no money. My jewels are not worth a couple of £100, now that I've got rid of the best part of them. What could I do? I must go back to the old life, the old, hard, cruel, wretched life, the life of poverty, and humiliation, and vexation, and discontent. I should have to go back and wear myself out in that long struggle, and die, as my mother died, perhaps." My lady stood still for a moment on the smooth lawn between the quadrangle and the archway, with her head drooping upon her breast and her hands locked together, debating this question in the unnatural activity of her mind. Her attitude reflected the state of that mind. It expressed irresolution and perplexity. But presently a sudden change came over her. She lifted her head, lifted it with an action of defiance and determination. "No, Mr. Robert Audley," she said aloud in a low, clear voice. "I will not go back. I will not go back. If the struggle between us is to be a duel to the death, you shall not find me drop my weapon." She walked with a firm and rapid step under the archway. As she passed under that massive arch, it seemed as if she disappeared into some black gulf that had waited open to receive her. The stupid clock struck 12, and the whole archway seemed to vibrate under its heavy strokes, as Lady Audley emerged upon the other side and joined Phoebe Marks, who had waited for her late mistress very near the gateway of the court. "Now, Phoebe," she said, "it is 3 miles from here to Mount Stanning, isn't it?" "Yes, my lady." "Then we can walk the distance in an hour and a half." Lady Audley had not stopped to say this. She was walking quickly along the avenue with her humble companion by her side. Fragile and delicate as she was in appearance, she was a very good walker. She had been in the habit of taking long country rambles with Mr. Dawson's children in her old days of dependence, and she thought very little of a distance of 3 miles. "Your beautiful husband will sit up for you, I suppose, Phoebe," she said, as they struck across an open field that was used as a short cut from Audley Court to the high road. "Oh, yes, my lady. He's sure to sit up. He'll be drinking with the man, I dare say." "The man? What man?" "The man that's in possession, my lady." "Ah, to be sure," said Lady Audley indifferently. It was strange that Phoebe's domestic troubles should seem so very far from her thoughts at the time she was taking such an extraordinary step towards setting things right at the Castle Inn. The 2 women crossed the field and turned into the high road. The way to Mount Stanning was all uphill, and the long road looked black and dreary in the dark night, but my lady walked on with a desperate courage, which was no common constituent in her selfish, sensuous nature, but a strange faculty born out of her great despair. She did not speak again to her companion until they were close upon the glimmering lights at the top of the hill. One of these village lights, glaring redly through a crimson curtain, marked out the particular window behind which it was likely that Luke Marks sat nodding drowsily over his liquor and waiting for the coming of his wife. "He has not gone to bed, Phoebe," said my lady eagerly, "but there is no other light burning at the inn. I suppose Mr. Audley is in bed and asleep." "Yes, my lady, I suppose so." "You are sure he was going to stay at the castle tonight?" "Oh, yes, my lady. I helped the girl to get his room ready before I came away." The wind, boisterous everywhere, was even shriller and more pitiless in the neighborhood of that bleak hilltop upon which the Castle Inn reared its rickety walls. The cruel blasts raved wildly around that frail erection. They disported themselves with the shattered pigeon-house, the broken weathercock, the loose tiles and unshapely chimneys. They rattled at the window-panes and whistled in the crevices. They mocked the feeble building from foundation to roof, and battered and banged and tormented it in their fierce gambols, until it trembled and rocked with the force of their rough play. Mr. Luke Marks had not troubled himself to secure the door of his dwelling-house before sitting down to booze with the man who held provisional possession of his goods and chattels. The landlord of the Castle Inn was a lazy, sensual brute, who had no thought higher than a selfish concern for his own enjoyments, and a virulent hatred for anybody who stood in the way of his gratification. Phoebe pushed open the door with her hand and went into the house, followed by my lady. The gas was flaring in the bar, and smoking the low plastered ceiling. The door of the bar parlor was half open, and Lady Audley heard the brutal laughter of Mr. Marks as she crossed the threshold of the inn. "I'll tell him you're here, my lady," whispered Phoebe to her late mistress. "I know he'll be tipsy. You won't be offended, my lady, if he should say anything rude. You know it wasn't my wish that you should come." "Yes, yes," answered Lady Audley impatiently. "I know that. What should I care for his rudeness? Let him say what he likes." Phoebe Marks pushed open the parlor door, leaving my lady in the bar close behind her. Luke sat with his clumsy legs stretched out upon the hearth. He held a glass of gin and water in one hand and the poker in the other. He had just thrust the poker into a heap of black coals, and was scattering them to make a blaze, when his wife appeared upon the threshold of the room. He snatched the poker from between the bars, and made a half-drunken, half-threatening motion with it as he saw her. "So you've condescended to come home at last, ma'am," he said. "I thought you was never coming home no more." He spoke in a thick and drunken voice, and was by no means too intelligible. He was steeped to the very lips in alcohol. His eyes were dim and watery, his hands were unsteady, his voice was choked and muffled with drink. A brute, even when most sober, a brute even on his best behavior, he was 10 times more brutal in his drunkenness, when the few restraints which held his ignorant, everyday brutality in check were flung aside in the indolent recklessness of intoxication. I've been longer than I intended to be, Luke," Phoebe answered in her most conciliatory manner. "But I've seen my lady, and she's been very kind, and she'll settle this business for us."
"She's been very kind, has she?" muttered Mr. Marks with a drunken laugh. "Thank her for nothing. I know the valley of her kindness. She'd be uncommon kind, I dessay, if she weren't obliged to be it."
The man in possession, who had fallen into a maudlin and semi-unconscious state of intoxication upon about a third of the liquor that Mr. Marks had consumed, only stared in feeble wonderment at his host and hostess. He sat near the table. Indeed, he had hooked himself onto it with his elbows, as a safeguard against sliding under it, and he was making imbecile attempts to light his pipe at the flame of a guttering tallow candle near him. "My lady has promised to settle the business for us, Luke," Phoebe repeated, without noticing Luke's remarks. She knew her husband's dogged nature well enough by this time to know that it was worse than useless to try to stop him from doing or saying anything which his own stubborn will led him to do or say. "My lady will settle it," she said, "and she's come down here to see about it tonight," she added. The poker dropped from the landlord's hand and fell clattering among the cinders on the hearth.
"My Lady Audley come here tonight?" he said.
"Yes, Luke." My lady appeared upon the threshold of the door as Phoebe spoke. "Yes, Luke Marks," she said. "I have come to pay this man, and to send him about his business." Lady Audley said these words in a strange, semi-mechanical manner, very much as if she had learned the sentence by rote, and were repeating it without knowing what she said. Mr. Marks gave a discontented growl, and set his empty glass down upon the table with an impatient gesture.
"You might have given the money to Phoebe," he said, "as well as have brought it yourself. We don't want no fine ladies up here prying and poking their precious noses into everythink."
Luke," remonstrated Phoebe, "when my lady has been so kind."
"Oh, damn her kindness!" cried Mr. Marks. "It ain't her kindness we want, gal, it's her money. She won't get no snivelling gratitude from me. Whatever she does for us, she does because she is obliged, and if she wasn't obliged, she wouldn't do it."
Heaven knows how much more Luke Marks might have said, had not my lady turned upon him suddenly and awed him into silence by the unearthly glitter of her beauty. Her hair had been blown away from her face, and being of a light feathery quality, had spread itself into a tangled mass that surrounded her forehead like a yellow flame. There was another flame in her eyes, a greenish light, such as might flash from the changing-hued orbs of an angry mermaid. "Stop!" she cried. "I didn't come up here in the dead of night to listen to your insolence. How much is this debt?"
£9.
Lady Audley produced her purse, a toy of ivory, silver, and turquoise. She took from it a note and 4 sovereigns. She laid these upon the table. "Let that man give me a receipt for the money," she said, "before I go." It was some time before the man could be roused into sufficient consciousness for the performance of this simple duty, and it was only by dipping a pen into the ink and pushing it between his clumsy fingers that he was at last made to comprehend that his autograph was wanted at the bottom of the receipt which had been made out by Phoebe Marks. Lady Audley took the document as soon as the ink was dry, and turned to leave the parlor. Phoebe followed her. "You mustn't go home alone, my lady," she said. "You'll let me go with you." Yes, you shall go home with me." The 2 women were standing near the door of the inn as my lady said this. Phoebe stared wonderingly at her patroness. She had expected that Lady Audley would be in a hurry to return home after settling this business which she had capriciously taken upon herself, but it was not so. My lady stood leaning against the inn door and staring into vacancy, and again Mrs. Marks began to fear that trouble had driven her late mistress mad. A little Dutch clock in the bar struck 2 while Lady Audley lingered in this irresolute, absent manner. She started at the sound and began to tremble violently. "I think I am going to faint, Phoebe," she said. "Where can I get some cold water?" "The pump is in the wash-house, my lady. I'll run and get you a glass of cold water." No," cried my lady, clutching Phoebe's arm as she was about to run away upon this errand. "I'll get it myself. I must dip my head in a basin of water if I want to save myself from fainting. In which room does Mr. Audley sleep?" There was something so irrelevant in this question that Phoebe Marks stared aghast at her mistress before she answered it. "It was number 3 that I got ready, my lady, the front room, the room next to ours," she replied after that pause of astonishment. "Give me a candle," said my lady. "I'll go into your room, and get some water for my head. Stay where you are, and see that that brute of a husband of yours does not follow me." She snatched the candle which Phoebe had lighted from the girl's hand, and ran up the rickety, winding staircase which led to the narrow corridor upon the upper floor. 5 bedrooms opened out of this low-ceilinged, close-smelling corridor. The number of these rooms were indicated by squat black figures painted upon the panels of the doors. Lady Audley had driven up to Mount Stanning to inspect the house when she bought the business for her servant's bridegroom, and she knew her way about the dilapidated old place. She knew where to find Phoebe's bedroom, but she stopped before the door of that other chamber which had been prepared for Mr. Robert Audley. She stopped and looked at the number on the door. The key was in the lock, and her hand dropped upon it as if unconsciously. But presently she suddenly began to tremble again, as she had trembled a few minutes before, at the striking of the clock. She stood for a few moments trembling thus, with her hand still upon the key. Then a horrible expression came over her face, and she turned the key in the lock. She turned it twice, double locking the door. There was no sound from within. The occupant of the chamber made no sign of having heard that ominous creaking of the rusty key in the rusty lock. Lady Audley hurried into the next room. She set the candle on the dressing-table, flung off her bonnet, and slung it loosely across her arm. Then she went to the washstand and filled the basin with water. She plunged her golden hair into this water, and then stood for a few moments in the center of the room looking about her, with a white, earnest face, and an eager gaze that seemed to take in every object in the poorly furnished chamber. Phoebe's bedroom was certainly very shabbily furnished. She had been compelled to select all the most decent things for those best bedrooms which were set apart for any chance traveler who might stop for a night's lodging at the Castle Inn. But Phoebe Marks had done her best to atone for the lack of substantial furniture in her apartment by a superabundance of drapery. Crisp curtains of cheap chintz hung from the tent bedstead. Festooned drapery of the same material shrouded the narrow window shutting out the light of day, and affording a pleasant harbor for tribes of flies and predatory bands of spiders. Even the looking-glass, a miserably cheap construction which distorted every face whose owner had the hardihood to look into it, stood upon a draperied altar of starched muslin and pink glazed calico, and was adorned with frills of lace and knitted work. My lady smiled as she looked at the festoons and furbelows which met her eyes upon every side. She had reason, perhaps, to smile, remembering the costly elegance of her own apartments, but there was something in that sardonic smile that seemed to have a deeper meaning than any natural contempt for Phoebe's attempts at decoration. She went to the dressing-table, and smoothed her wet hair before the looking-glass, and then put on her bonnet. She was obliged to place the flaming tallow candle very close to the lace furbelows about the glass, so close that the starched muslin seemed to draw the flame toward it by some power of attraction in its fragile tissue. Phoebe waited anxiously by the inn door for my lady's coming. She watched the minute hand of the little Dutch clock, wondering at the slowness of its progress. It was only 10 minutes past 2 when Lady Audley came downstairs, with her bonnet on and her hair still wet, but without the candle. Phoebe was immediately anxious about this missing candle. "The light, my lady," she said. "You have left it upstairs." "The wind blew it out as I was leaving your room," Lady Audley answered, quietly. "I left it there." "In my room, my lady?" "Yes." "And it was quite out?" "Yes, I tell you. Why do you worry me about your candle? It is past 2 o'clock. Come." She took the girl's arm, and half led, half dragged her from the house. The convulsive pressure of her slight hand held her firmly as an iron vice could have held her. The fierce March wind banged to the door of the house, and left the 2 women standing outside it. The long black road lay bleak and desolate before them, dimly visible between straight lines of leafless hedges. A walk of 3 miles' length upon a lonely country road, between the hours of 2 and 4 on a cold winter's morning, is scarcely a pleasant task for a delicate woman, a woman whose inclinations lean toward ease and luxury. But my lady hurried along the hard, dry highway, dragging her companion with her as if she had been impelled by some horrible demonic force which knew no abatement. With the black night above them, with the fierce wind howling around them, sweeping across a broad expanse of hidden country, blowing as if it had arisen simultaneously from every point of the compass, and making those wanderers the focus of its ferocity, the 2 women walked through the darkness down the hill upon which Mount Stanning stood, along a 1.5 miles of flat road, and then up another hill, on the western side of which Audley Court lay in that sheltered valley, which seemed to shut in the old house from all the clamor and hubbub of the everyday world. My lady stopped upon the summit of this hill to draw breath and to clasp her hands upon her heart, in the vain hope that she might still its cruel beating. They were now within 3/4 of a mile of the court, and they had been walking for nearly an hour since they left the Castle Inn. Lady Audley stopped to rest, with her face still turned toward the place of her destination. Phoebe Marks, stopping also, and very glad of a moment's pause in that hurried journey, looked back into the far darkness beneath which lay that dreary shelter that had given her so much uneasiness, and as she did so, she uttered a shrill cry of horror, and clutched wildly at her companion's cloak. The night sky was no longer all dark. The thick blackness was broken by one patch of lurid light. "My lady, my lady!" cried Phoebe, pointing to this lurid patch. "Do you see?" "Yes, child, I see," answered Lady Audley, trying to shake the clinging hands from her garments. "What's the matter?" "It's a fire! A fire, my lady!" "Yes, I'm afraid it is a fire. At Brentwood, most likely. Let me go, Phoebe. It's nothing to us." "Yes, yes, my lady. It's nearer than Brentwood. Much nearer. It's at Mount Stanning." Lady Audley did not answer. She was trembling again, with the cold perhaps, for the wind had torn her heavy cloak from her shoulders, and had left her slender figure exposed to the blast. "It's at Mount Stanning, my lady," cried Phoebe Marks. "It's the castle that's on fire. I know it is, I know it is. I thought of fire tonight, and I was fidgety and uneasy, for I knew this would happen some day. I wouldn't mind if it was only the wretched place, but there'll be life lost, there'll be life lost," sobbed the girl distractedly. "There's Luke too tipsy to help himself, unless others help him. There's Mr. Audley asleep." Phoebe Marks stopped suddenly at the mention of Robert's name, and fell upon her knees, clasping her uplifted hands, and appealing wildly to Lady Audley. "Oh, my God!" she cried. "Say it's not true, my lady. Say it's not true. It's too horrible. It's too horrible. It's too horrible." "What's too horrible?" "The thought that's in my mind. The terrible thought that's in my mind." "What do you mean, girl?" cried my lady fiercely. "Oh, God, forgive me if I'm wrong," the kneeling woman gasped in detached sentences. "And God grant I may be. Why did you go up to the castle, my lady? Why were you so set on going against all I could say? You who were so bitter against Mr. Audley and against Luke, and who knew that they were both under that roof. Oh, tell me that I do you a cruel wrong, my lady. Tell me so, tell me, for as there is a heaven above me, I think that you went to that place tonight on purpose to set fire to it. Tell me that I'm wrong, my lady. Tell me that I'm doing you a wicked wrong." "I will tell you nothing, except that you are a mad woman," answered Lady Audley in a cold, hard voice. "Get up, fool, idiot, coward! Is your husband such a precious bargain that you should be grovelling there, lamenting and groaning for him? What is Robert Audley to you, that you behave like a maniac, because you think he is in danger? How do you know the fire is at Mount Stanning? You see a red patch in the sky, and you cry out directly that your own paltry hovel is in flames, as if there were no place in the world that could be burnt except that. The fire may be at Brentwood, or further away, at Romford, or still further away, on the eastern side of London, perhaps. Get up, mad woman, and go back and look after your goods and chattels, and your husband and your lodger. Get up and go. I don't want you." "Oh, my lady, forgive me," sobbed Phoebe. "There's nothing you can say to me that's hard enough for having done you such a wrong, even my thoughts. I don't mind your cruel words. I don't mind anything if I'm wrong." "Go back and see for yourself," answered Lady Audley sternly. "I tell you again, I don't want you." She walked away in the darkness, leaving Phoebe Marks still kneeling upon the hard road where she had cast herself in that agony of supplication. Sir Michael's wife walked toward the house in which her husband slept, with the red blaze lighting up the skies behind her, and with nothing but the blackness of the night before. Chapter 33. The Bearer of the Tidings. It was very late the next morning when Lady Audley emerged from her dressing-room, exquisitely dressed in a morning costume of delicate muslin, delicate laces, and embroideries, but with a very pale face, and with half-circles of purple shadow under her eyes. She accounted for this pale face and these hollow eyes by declaring that she had sat up reading until a very late hour on the previous night. Sir Michael and his young wife breakfasted in the library at a comfortable round table, wheeled close to the blazing fire, and Alicia was compelled to share this meal with her stepmother, however she might avoid that lady in the long interval between breakfast and dinner. The March morning was bleak and dull, and a drizzling rain fell incessantly, obscuring the landscape and blotting out the distance. There were very few letters by the morning post. The daily newspapers did not arrive until noon, and such aids to conversation being missing, there was very little talk at the breakfast table. Alicia looked out at the drizzling rain drifting against the broad window panes. "No chance of riding today," she said, "and no chance of any callers to enliven us, unless that ridiculous Bob comes crawling through the wet from Mount Stanning." Have you ever heard anybody, whom you know to be dead, alluded to in a light, easy-going manner by another person who did not know of his death, alluded to as doing this or that, as performing some trivial everyday operation, when you know that he has vanished away from the face of this earth, and separated himself forever from all living creatures in their commonplace pursuits, in the awful solemnity of death? Such a chance allusion, insignificant though it may be, is apt to send a strange thrill of pain through the mind. The ignorant remark jars discordantly upon the hypersensitive brain. The king of terrors is desecrated by that unwitting disrespect. Heaven knows what hidden reason my lady may have had for experiencing some such revulsion of feeling on the sudden mention of Mr. Audley's name, but her pale face blanched to a sickly white as Alicia Audley spoke of her cousin. "Yes, he will come down here in the wet, perhaps," the young lady continued, "with his hat sleek and shining as if it had been brushed with a pat of fresh butter, and with white vapors steaming out of his clothes, and making him look like an awkward genie just let out of his bottle. He will come down here and print impressions of his muddy boots all over the carpet, and he'll sit on your Gobelin tapestry, my lady, in his wet overcoat, and he'll abuse you if you remonstrate, and will ask why people have chairs that are not to be sat upon, and why you don't live in Fig Tree Court, and—" Sir Michael Audley watched his daughter with a thoughtful countenance as she talked of her cousin. She very often talked of him, ridiculing him and inveighing against him in no very measured terms. But perhaps the baronet thought of a certain Signora Beatrice, who very cruelly entreated a gentleman called Benedick, but who was, it may be, heartily in love with him at the same time.
"What do you think Major Melville told me when he called here yesterday, Alicia?" Sir Michael asked presently.
"I haven't the remotest idea," replied Alicia rather disdainfully. "Perhaps he told you that we should have another war before long, by Ged, sir, or perhaps he told you that we should have a new ministry, by Ged, sir, for those fellows are getting themselves into a mess, sir, or that those other fellows are reforming this, and cutting down that, and altering the other in the army, until, by Ged, sir, we shall have no army at all by and by, nothing but a pack of boys, sir, crammed up to the eyes with a lot of senseless schoolmaster's rubbish, and dressed in shell jackets and calico helmets. Yes, sir, they're fighting in Oud in calico helmets at this very day, sir." "You're an impertinent minx, miss," answered the baronet. "Major Melville told me nothing of the kind. But he told me that a very devoted admirer of you, a certain Sir Harry Towers, has forsaken his place in Hertfordshire, and his hunting stable, and has gone on the Continent for a 12-months' tour." Miss Audley flushed up suddenly at the mention of her old adorer, but recovered herself very quickly. "He has gone on the Continent, has he?" she said indifferently. "He told me that he meant to do so if he didn't have everything his own way. Poor fellow! He's a dear, good-hearted, stupid creature, and 20 times better than that peripatetic patent refrigerator, Mr. Robert Audley."
"I wish, Alicia, that you were not so fond of ridiculing Bob," Sir Michael said gravely. "Bob is a good fellow, and I'm as fond of him as if he'd been my own son. And I've been very uncomfortable about him lately. He has changed very much within the last few days, and he has taken all sorts of absurd ideas into his head, and my lady has alarmed me about him. She thinks—"
Lady Audley interrupted her husband with a grave shake of her head. "It is better not to say too much about it as yet awhile," she said. "Alicia knows what I think." "Yes," replied Miss Audley, "my lady thinks that Bob is going mad, but I know better than that. He's not at all the sort of person to go mad. How should such a sluggish ditch-pond of an intellect as his ever work itself into a tempest? He may move about for the rest of his life, perhaps, in a tranquil state of semi-idiocy, imperfectly comprehending who he is, and where he's going, and what he's doing, but he'll never go mad." Sir Michael did not reply to this. He had been very much disturbed by his conversation with my lady on the previous evening, and had silently debated the painful question in his mind ever since. His wife, the woman he best loved and most believed in, had told him, with all appearance of regret and agitation, her conviction of his nephew's insanity. He tried in vain to arrive at the conclusion he wished most ardently to attain. He tried in vain to think that my lady was misled by her own fancies, and had no foundation for what she said. But then again it suddenly flashed upon him that to think this was to arrive at a worse conclusion. It was to transfer the horrible suspicion from his nephew to his wife. She appeared to be possessed with an actual conviction of Robert's insanity. To imagine her wrong was to imagine some weakness in her own mind. The longer he thought of the subject, the more it harassed and perplexed him. It was most certain that the young man had always been eccentric. He was sensible, he was tolerably clever, he was honorable and gentlemanlike in feeling, though perhaps a little careless in the performance of certain minor social duties. But there were some slight differences, not easily to be defined, that separated him from other men of his age and position. Then again, it was equally true that he had very much changed within the period that had succeeded the disappearance of George Talboys. He had grown moody and thoughtful, melancholy and absent-minded. He had held himself aloof from society, had sat for hours without speaking, had talked at other points by fits and starts, and had excited himself unusually in the discussion of subjects which apparently lay far out of the region of his own life and interests. Then there was even another region which seemed to strengthen my lady's case against this unhappy young man. He had been brought up in the frequent society of his cousin Alicia, his pretty, genial cousin, to whom interest, and one would have thought affection, naturally pointed as his most fitting bride. More than this, the girl had shown him, in the innocent guilelessness of a transparent nature, that on her side at least, affection was not wanting. And yet, in spite of all this, he had held himself aloof, and had allowed others to propose for her hand, and to be rejected by her, and had still made no sign. Now love is so very subtle in essence, such an indefinable metaphysical marvel, that its due force, though very cruelly felt by the sufferer himself, is never clearly understood by those who look on at its torments, and wonder why he takes the common fever so badly. Sir Michael argued that because Alicia was a pretty girl and an amiable girl, it was therefore extraordinary and unnatural in Robert Audley not to have duly fallen in love with her. This baronet, who close upon his 60th birthday, had for the first time encountered that one woman who out of all the women in the world had power to quicken the pulses of his heart, wondered why Robert failed to take the fever from the first breath of contagion that blew toward him. He forgot that there are men who go their ways unscathed amidst legions of lovely and generous women, to succumb at last before some harsh-featured virago, who knows the secret of that only philtre which can intoxicate and bewitch him. He had forgot that there are certain Jacks who go through life without meeting the Jill appointed for them by Nemesis, and die old bachelors, perhaps, with poor Jill pining an old maid upon the other side of the party-wall. He forgot that love, which is a madness, and a scourge, and a fever, and a delusion, and a snare, is also a mystery, and very imperfectly understood by everyone except the individual sufferer who writhes under its tortures. Jones, who is wildly enamored of Miss Brown, and who lies awake at night until he loathes his comfortable pillow, and tumbles his sheets into twisted rags of linen in his agonies, as if he were a prisoner and wanted to wind them into impromptu ropes, this same Jones who thinks Russell Square a magic place because his divinity inhabits it, and who thinks the trees in that enclosure and the sky above it greener and bluer than other trees or sky, and who feels a pang, yes, an actual pang of mingled hope and joy and expectation and terror when he emerges from Guilford Street, descending from the heights of Islington, into those sacred precincts. This very Jones is hard and callous toward the torments of Smith, who adores Miss Robinson, and cannot imagine what the infatuated fellow can see in the girl. So it was with Sir Michael Audley. He looked at his nephew as a sample of a very large class of young men, and his daughter as a sample of an equally extensive class of feminine goods, and could not see why the two samples should not make a very respectable match. He ignored all those infinitesimal differences in nature which make the wholesome food of one man the deadly poison of another. How difficult it is to believe sometimes that a man doesn't like such and such a favorite dish. If at a dinner party a meek-looking guest refuses early salmon and cucumbers, or green peas in February, we set him down as a poor relation whose instincts warn him off those expensive plates. If an alderman were to declare that he didn't like green fat, he would be looked upon as a social martyr, a Marcus Curtius of the dinner-table, who immolated himself for the benefit of his kind. His fellow aldermen would believe in anything rather than a heretical distaste for the city ambrosia of the soup tureen. But there are people who dislike salmon, and whitebait, and spring ducklings, and all manner of old-established delicacies, and there are other people who affect eccentric and despicable dishes, generally stigmatized as nasty. Alas, my pretty Alicia, your cousin did not love you. He admired your rosy English face, and had a tender affection for you which might perhaps have expanded by and by into something warm enough for matrimony, that everyday jog-trot species of union which demands no very passionate devotion, but for a sudden check which it had received in Dorsetshire. Yes, Robert Audley's growing affection for his cousin, a plant of very slow growth, I am fain to confess, had been suddenly dwarfed and stunted upon that bitter February day on which he had stood beneath the pine trees talking to Clara Talboys. Since that day the young man had experienced an unpleasant sensation in thinking of poor Alicia. He looked at her as being in some vague manner an encumbrance upon the freedom of his thoughts. He had a haunting fear that he was in some tacit way pledged to her, that she had a species of claim upon him, which forbade to him the right of thinking of another woman. I believe it was the image of Miss Audley presented to him in this light that goaded the young barrister into those outbursts of splenetic rage against the female sex which he was liable to at certain times. He was strictly honorable, so honorable that he would rather have immolated himself upon the altar of truth and Alicia than have done her the remotest wrong, though by so doing he might have secured his own comfort and happiness. "If the poor little girl loves me," he thought, "and if she thinks that I love her, and has been led to think so by any word or act of mine, I'm in duty bound to let her think so to the end of time, and to fulfill any tacit promise which I may have unconsciously made. I meant once to make her an offer by and by, when this horrible mystery about George Talboys should have been cleared up, and everything peacefully settled. But now—" His thoughts would ordinarily wander away at this point of his reflections, carrying him where he had never intended to go, carrying him back under the pine trees in Dorsetshire, and setting him once more face to face with the sister of his missing friend, and it was generally a very laborious journey by which he travelled back to the point from which he strayed. It was so difficult for him to tear himself away from the stunted turf and the pine trees. "Poor little girl," he would think on coming back to Alicia, "how good it is of her to love me, and how grateful ought I to be for her tenderness. How many fellows would think such a generous, loving heart the highest boon that earth could give them? There's Sir Harry Towers stricken with despair at his rejection. He would give me half his estate, all his estate, twice his estate, if he had it, to be in the shoes which I am anxious to shake off my ungrateful feet. Why don't I love her? Why is it that although I know her to be pretty, and pure and good and truthful, I don't love her? Her image never haunts me, except reproachfully. I never see her in my dreams. I never wake up suddenly in the dead of the night, with her eyes shining upon me, and her warm breath upon my cheek, or with the fingers of her soft hand clinging to mine. No, I'm not in love with her. I can't fall in love with her." He raged and rebelled against his ingratitude. He tried to argue himself into a passionate attachment for his cousin, but he failed ignominiously, and the more he tried to think of Alicia, the more he thought of Clara Talboys. I am speaking now of his feelings in the period that elapsed between his return from Dorsetshire and his visit to Grange Heath. Sir Michael sat by the library fire after breakfast upon this wretched rainy morning, writing letters and reading the newspapers. Alicia shut herself in her own apartment to read the third volume of a novel. Lady Audley locked the door of the octagon antechamber, and roamed up and down the suite of rooms from the bedroom to the boudoir all through that weary morning. She had locked the door to guard against the chance of anyone coming in suddenly and observing her before she was aware, before she had had sufficient warning to enable her to face their scrutiny. Her pale face seemed to grow paler as the morning advanced. A tiny medicine chest was open upon the dressing-table, and little stoppered bottles of red lavender, sal volatile, chloroform, chlorodyne, and ether were scattered about. Once my lady paused before this medicine chest, and took out the remaining bottles, half absently perhaps, until she came to one which was filled with a thick, dark liquid, and labeled opium, poison. She trifled a long time with this last bottle, holding it up to the light, and even removing the stopper and smelling the sickly liquid. But she put it from her suddenly with a shudder. "If I could," she muttered. "If only I could do it. And yet why should I now?" She clenched her small hands as she uttered the last words, and walked to the window of the dressing-room, which looked straight toward that ivied archway under which any one must come who came from Mount Stanning to the court. There were smaller gates in the gardens which led into the meadows behind the court, but there was no other way of coming from Mount Stanning or Brentwood than by the principal entrance. The solitary hand of the clock over the archway was midway between 1 and 2 when my lady looked at it. "How slow the time is," she said wearily. "How slow, How slow! Shall I grow old like this, I wonder, with every minute of my life seeming like an hour?" She stood for a few minutes watching the archway, but no one passed under it while she looked, and she turned impatiently away from the window to resume her weary wandering about the rooms. Whatever fire that had been which had reflected itself vividly in the black sky, no tidings of it had as yet come to Audley Court. The day was miserably wet and windy, altogether the very last day upon which even the most confirmed idler and gossip would care to venture out. It was not a market day, and there were therefore very few passengers upon the road between Brentwood and Chelmsford, so that as yet no news of the fire, which had occurred in the dead of the wintry night, had reached the village of Audley, or travelled from the village to the court. The girl with the rose-colored ribbons came to the door of the anteroom to summon her mistress to luncheon, but Lady Audley only opened the door a little way, and intimated her intention of taking no luncheon. "My head aches terribly, Martin," she said. "I shall go and lie down till dinner-time. You may come at 5 to dress me." Lady Audley said this with the predetermination of dressing at 4, and thus dispensing with the services of her attendant. Among all privileged spies, a lady's maid has the highest privileges. It is she who bathes Lady Teresa's eyes with eau de cologne after her ladyship's quarrel with the colonel. It is she who administers sal volatile to Miss Fanny when Count Beaudesert of the Blues has jilted her. She has 100 methods for the finding out of her mistress's secrets. She knows by the manner in which her victim jerks her head from under the hairbrush, or chafes at the gentlest administration of the comb, what hidden tortures are racking her breast, what secret perplexities are bewildering her brain. That well-bred attendant knows how to interpret the most obscure diagnosis of all mental diseases that can afflict her mistress. She knows when the ivory complexion is bought and paid for, when the pearly teeth are foreign substances fashioned by the dentist, when the glossy plaits are the relics of the dead rather than the property of the living, and she knows other and more sacred secrets than these. She knows when the sweet smile is more false than Madame Levenson's enamel, and far less enduring, when the words that issue from between gates of borrowed pearl are more disguised and painted than the lips which help to shape them, when the lovely fairy of the ballroom re-enters the dressing-room after the night's-long revelry, and throws aside her voluminous burnous and her faded bouquet, and drops her mask, and like another Cinderella loses the glass slipper, by whose glitter she has been distinguished, and falls back into her rags and dirt, the lady's maid is by to see the transformation. The valet who took wages from the prophet of Chorazin must have seen his master sometimes unveiled, and must have laughed in his sleeve at the folly of the monster's worshippers. Lady Audley had made no confidant of her new maid, and on this day of all others she wished to be alone. She did lie down. She cast herself wearily upon the luxurious sofa in the dressing-room, and buried her face in the down pillows and tried to sleep. Sleep. She had almost forgotten what it was, that tender restorer of tired nature. It seemed so long now since she had slept. It was only about 48 hours, perhaps, but it appeared an intolerable time. Her fatigue of the night before, and her unnatural excitement had worn her out at last. She did fall asleep. She fell into a heavy slumber that was almost like stupor. She had taken a few drops out of the opium bottle in a glass of water before lying down. The clock over the mantelpiece chimed the 4:15 as she woke suddenly and started up, with the cold perspiration breaking out in icy drops upon her forehead. She had dreamt that every member of the household was clamoring at the door, eager to tell her of a dreadful fire that had happened in the night. There was no sound but the flapping of the ivy leaves against the glass, the occasional falling of a cinder, and the steady ticking of the clock. "Perhaps I shall always be dreaming these sorts of dreams," my lady thought, "until the terror of them kills me." The rain had ceased, and the cold spring sunshine was glittering upon the windows. Lady Audley dressed herself rapidly but carefully. I do not say that even in her supremest hour of misery she still retained her pride in her beauty. It was not so. She looked upon that beauty as a weapon, and she felt that she had now double need to be well armed. She dressed herself in her most gorgeous silk, a voluminous robe of silvery, shimmering blue, that made her look as if she had been arrayed in moonbeams. She shook out her hair into feathery showers of glittering gold, and with a cloak of white cashmere about her shoulders, went downstairs into the vestibule. She opened the door of the library and looked in. Sir Michael Audley was asleep in his easy-chair. As my lady softly closed this door, Alicia descended the stairs from her own room. The turret door was open, and the sun was shining upon the wet grass-plat in the quadrangle. The firm gravel walks were already very nearly dry, for the rain had ceased for upward of 2 hours. "Will you take a walk with me in the quadrangle?" Lady Audley asked as her stepdaughter approached. The armed neutrality between the two women admitted of any chance civility such as this. "Yes, if you please, my lady," Alicia answered rather listlessly. "I have been yawning over a stupid novel all the morning, and shall be very glad of a little fresh air." Heaven help the novelist whose fiction Miss Audley had been perusing, if he had no better critics than that young lady. She had read page after page without knowing what she had been reading, and had flung aside the volume half a dozen times to go to the window and watch for that visitor whom she had so confidently expected. Lady Audley led the way through the low doorway and onto the smooth gravel drive, by which carriages approached the house. She was still very pale, but the brightness of her dress and of her feathery golden ringlets distracted an observer's eyes from her pallid face. All mental distress is, with some show of reason, associated in our minds with loose, disordered garments and dishabilled hair, and an appearance in every way the reverse of my lady's. Why had she come out into the chill sunshine of that March afternoon to wander up and down that monotonous pathway with the stepdaughter she hated? She came because she was under the dominion of a horrible restlessness, which would not suffer her to remain within the house waiting for certain tidings which she knew must too surely come. At first she had wished to ward them off. At first she had wished that strange convulsions of nature might arise to hinder their coming, that abnormal winter lightnings must wither and destroy the messenger who carried them, that the ground might tremble and yawn beneath his hastening feet, and that impassable gulfs might separate the spot from which the tidings were to come and the place to which they were to be carried. She wished that the earth might stand still, and the paralyzed elements cease from their natural functions, that the progress of time might stop, that the day of judgment might come, and that she might thus be brought before an unearthly tribunal, and so escape the intervening shame and misery of any earthly judgment. In the wild chaos of her brain, every one of these thoughts had held its place, and in her short slumber on the sofa in her dressing-room, she had dreamed all these things and 100 other things, all bearing upon the same subject. She had dreamed that a brook, a tiny streamlet when she first saw it, flowed across the road between Mount Stanning and Audley, and gradually swelled into a river, and from a river became an ocean, till the village on the hill receded far away out of sight, and only a great waste of waters rolled where it had once been. She dreamt that she saw the messenger, now one person, now another, but never any probable person, hindered by 100 hindrances, now startling and terrible, now ridiculous and trivial, but never either natural or probable, and going down into the quiet house with the memory of these dreams strong upon her, she had been bewildered by the stillness which had betokened that the tidings had not yet come. And now her mind underwent a complete change. She no longer wished to delay the dreaded intelligence. She wished the agony, whatever it was to be, over and done with, the pain suffered and the release attained. It seemed to her as if the intolerable day would never come to an end, as if her mad wishes had been granted, and the progress of time had actually stopped. "What a long day it has been!" exclaimed Alicia, as if taking up the burden of my lady's thoughts. "Nothing but drizzle and mist and wind. And now that it's too late for anybody to go out, it must needs be fine," the young lady added, with an evident sense of injury. Lady Audley did not answer. She was looking at the stupid one-handed clock, and waiting for the news which must come sooner or later, which could not surely fail to come very speedily. "They have been afraid to come and tell him," she thought. "They have been afraid to break the news to Sir Michael. Who will come to tell it at last, I wonder? The rector of Mount Stanning, perhaps, or the doctor. Some important person, at least." If she could have gone out into the leafless avenues, or onto the high road beyond them, if she could have gone so far as that hill upon which she had so lately parted with Phoebe, she would gladly have done so. She would rather have suffered anything than that slow suspense, that corroding anxiety, that metaphysical dry rot in which heart and mind seemed to decay under an insufferable torture. She tried to talk, and by a painful effort contrived now and then to utter some commonplace remark. Under any ordinary circumstances her companion would have noticed her embarrassment, but Miss Audley, happening to be very much absorbed by her own vexations, was quite as well inclined to be silent as my lady herself. The monotonous walk up and down the gravelled pathway suited Alicia's humour. I think that she even took a malicious pleasure in the idea that she was very likely catching cold, and that her cousin Robert was answerable for her danger. If she could have brought upon herself inflammation of the lungs or ruptured blood vessels by that exposure to the chill March atmosphere, I think she would have felt a gloomy satisfaction in her sufferings. Perhaps Robert might care for me if I had inflammation of the lungs, she thought. He couldn't insult me by calling me a bouncer then. Bouncers don't have inflammation of the lungs. I believe she drew a picture of herself in the last stage of consumption, propped up by pillows in a great easy-chair, looking out of a window in the afternoon sunshine, with medicine bottles, a bunch of grapes, and a Bible upon a table by her side, and with Robert, all contrition and tenderness, summoned to receive her farewell blessing. She preached a whole chapter to him in that parting benediction, talking a great deal longer than was in keeping with her prostrate state, and very much enjoying her dismal castle in the air. Employed in this sentimental manner, Miss Audley took very little notice of her stepmother, and the one hand of the blundering clock had slipped to 6 by the time Robert had been blessed and dismissed. "Good gracious me!" she cried suddenly. 6 o'clock, and I'm not dressed. The half-hour bell rung in a cupola upon the roof while Alicia was speaking. "I must go in, my lady," she said. "Won't you come?" "Presently," answered Lady Audley. "I'm dressed, you see." Alicia ran off, but Sir Michael's wife still lingered in the quadrangle, still waited for those tidings which were so long coming. It was nearly dark. The blue mists of evening had slowly risen from the ground. The flat meadows were filled with a grey vapour, and a stranger might have fancied Audley Court a castle on the margin of a sea. Under the archway the shadows of fast-coming night lurked darkly, like traitors waiting for an opportunity to glide stealthily into the quadrangle. Through the archway a patch of cold blue sky glimmered faintly, streaked by one line of lurid crimson, and lighted by the dim glitter of one wintry-looking star. Not a creature was stirring in the quadrangle but the restless woman who paced up and down the straight pathways, listening for a footstep whose coming was to strike terror to her soul. She heard it at last, a footstep in the avenue upon the other side of the archway. But was it the footstep? Her sense of hearing, made unnaturally acute by excitement, told her that it was a man's footstep, told even more that it was the tread of a gentleman, no slouching, lumbering pedestrian in hobnailed boots, but a gentleman who walked firmly and well. Every sound fell like a lump of ice upon my lady's heart. She could not wait. She could not contain herself. She lost all self-control, all power of endurance, all capability of self-restraint, and she rushed toward the archway. She paused beneath its shadow, for the stranger was close upon her. She saw him, oh God, she saw him in that dim evening light. Her brain reeled, her heart stopped beating. She uttered no cry of surprise, no exclamation of terror, but staggered backward and clung for support to the ivied buttress of the archway. With her slender figure crouched into the angle formed by the buttress and the wall which it supported, she stood staring at the newcomer. As he approached her more closely, her knees sunk under her, and she dropped to the ground, not fainting, or in any manner unconscious, but sinking into a crouching attitude, and still crushed into the angle of the wall, as if she would have made a tomb for herself in the shadow of that sheltering brickwork. "My lady." The speaker was Robert Audley, he whose bedroom door she had double-locked 17 hours before at the Castle Inn. "What is the matter with you?" he said in a strange, constrained manner. "Get up, and let me take you indoors." He assisted her to rise, and she obeyed him very submissively. He took her arm in his strong hand, and led her across the quadrangle and into the lamp-lit hall. She shivered more violently than he had ever seen any woman shiver before, but she made no attempt at resistance to his will. Chapter 34. My Lady Tells the Truth. "Is there any room in which I can talk to you alone?" Robert Audley asked, as he looked dubiously round the hall. My lady only bowed her head in answer. She pushed open the door of the library, which had been left ajar. Sir Michael had gone to his dressing-room to prepare for dinner after a day of lazy enjoyment, perfectly legitimate for an invalid. The apartment was quite empty, only lighted by the blaze of the fire, as it had been upon the previous evening. Lady Audley entered the room, followed by Robert, who closed the door behind him. The wretched, shivering woman went to the fireplace, and knelt down before the blaze, as if any natural warmth could have power to check that unnatural chill. The young man followed her, and stood beside her upon the hearth, with his arm resting upon the chimney-piece. "Lady Audley," he said, in a voice whose icy sternness held out no hope of any tenderness or compassion, "I spoke to you last night very plainly, but you refused to listen to me. Tonight I must speak to you still more plainly, and you must no longer refuse to listen to me." My lady, crouching before the fire with her face hidden in her hands, uttered a low, sobbing sound which was almost a moan, but made no other answer.
"There was a fire last night at Mount Stanning, Lady Audley," the pitiless voice proceeded. "The Castle Inn, the house in which I slept, was burned to the ground. Do you know how I escaped perishing in that destruction?"
"No."
"I escaped by a most providential circumstance, which seems a very simple one. I did not sleep in the room which had been prepared for me. The place seemed wretchedly damp and chilly. The chimney smoked abominably when an attempt was made at lighting a fire, and I persuaded the servant to make me up a bed on the sofa in the small ground-floor sitting-room which I had occupied during the evening."
He paused for a moment, watching the crouching figure. The only change in my lady's attitude was that her head had fallen a little lower.
"Shall I tell you by whose agency the destruction of the Castle Inn was brought about, my lady?"
There was no answer.
"Shall I tell you?"
Still the same obstinate silence.
"My Lady Audley," cried Robert suddenly, "you are the incendiary. It was you whose murderous hand kindled those flames. It was you who thought by that thrice horrible deed to rid yourself of me, your enemy and denouncer. What was it to you that other lives might be sacrificed? If by a second massacre of St. Bartholomew you could have ridded yourself of me, you would have sacrificed an army of victims. The day is past for tenderness and mercy. For you I can no longer know pity or compunction. So far as by sparing your shame I can spare others who must suffer by your shame, I will be merciful, but no farther. If there were any secret tribunal before which you might be made to answer for your crimes, I would have little scruple in being your accuser, but I would spare that generous and high-born gentleman upon whose noble name your infamy would be reflected."
His voice softened as he made this allusion, and for a moment he broke down, but he recovered himself by an effort and continued.
"No life was lost in the fire of last night. I slept lightly, my lady, for my mind was troubled, as it has been for a long time, by the misery which I knew was lowering upon this house. It was I who discovered the breaking out of the fire in time to give the alarm and to save the servant girl and the poor drunken wretch who was very much burnt in spite of efforts, and who now lies in a precarious state at his mother's cottage. It was from him and from his wife that I learned who had visited the Castle Inn in the dead of night. The woman was almost distracted when she saw me, and from her I discovered the particulars of last night. Heaven knows what other secrets of yours she may hold, my lady, or how easily they might be extorted from her if I wanted her aid, which I do not. My path lies very straight before me. I have sworn to bring the murderer of George Talboys to justice, and I will keep my oath. I say that it was by your agency my friend met with his death. If I have wondered sometimes, as it was only natural I should, whether I was not the victim of some horrible hallucination, whether such an alternative was not more probable than that a young and lovely woman should be capable of so foul and treacherous a murder, all wonder is past. After last night's deed of horror, there is no crime you could commit, however vast and unnatural, which could make me wonder. Henceforth you must seem to me no longer a woman, a guilty woman with a heart which in its worst wickedness has yet some latent power to suffer and feel. I look upon you henceforth as the demonic incarnation of some evil principle. But you shall no longer pollute this place by your presence, unless you will confess what you are and who you are in the presence of the man you have deceived so long, and accept from him and from me such mercy as we may be inclined to extend to you. I will gather together the witnesses who shall swear to your identity, and at peril of any shame to myself and those I love, I will bring upon you the just and awful punishment of your crime."
The woman rose suddenly and stood before him erect and resolute, with her hair dashed away from her face and her eyes glittering. "Bring Sir Michael," she cried. "Bring him here, and I will confess anything, everything. What do I care? God knows I have struggled hard enough against you, and fought the battle patiently enough, but you have conquered, Mr. Robert Audley. It is a great triumph, is it not? A wonderful victory. You have used your cool, calculating, frigid, luminous intellect to a noble purpose. You have conquered a mad woman."
"A mad woman?" cried Mr. Audley.
"Yes, a mad woman. When you say that I killed George Talboys, you say the truth. When you say that I murdered him treacherously and foully, you lie. I killed him because I am mad, because my intellect is a little way upon the wrong side of that narrow boundary line between sanity and insanity, because when George Talboys goaded me, as you have goaded me, and reproached me, and threatened me, my mind, never properly balanced, utterly lost its balance, and I was mad. Bring Sir Michael, and bring him quickly. If he is to be told one thing, let him be told everything. Let him hear the secret of my life." Robert Audley left the room to look for his uncle. He went in search of that honored kinsman with God knows how heavy a weight of anguish at his heart, for he knew he was about to shatter the daydream of his uncle's life, and he knew that our dreams are none the less terrible to lose because they have never been the realities for which we have mistaken them. But even in the midst of his sorrow for Sir Michael, he could not help wondering at my lady's last words, "the secret of my life." He remembered those lines in the letter written by Helen Talboys upon the eve of her flight from Wildernsea, which had so puzzled him. He remembered those appealing sentences, "You should forgive me, for you know why I have been so. You know the secret of my life." He met Sir Michael in the hall. He made no attempt to prepare the way for the terrible revelation which the baronet was to hear. He only drew him into the firelit library, and there for the first time addressed him quietly thus: "Lady Audley has a confession to make to you, sir. A confession which I know will be a most cruel surprise, a most bitter grief. But it is necessary for your present honor and for your future peace that you should hear it. She has deceived you, I regret to say, most basely. But it is only right that you should hear from her own lips any excuses which she may have to offer for her wickedness. May God soften this blow for you," sobbed the young man, suddenly breaking down. "I cannot." Sir Michael lifted his hand as if he would command his nephew to be silent, but that imperious hand dropped feeble and impotent at his side. He stood in the center of the firelit room, rigid and immobile. "Lucy," he cried, in a voice whose anguish struck like a blow upon the jarred nerves of those who heard it, as the cry of a wounded animal pains the listener. "Lucy, tell me that this man is a madman. Tell me so, my love, or I shall kill him." There was a sudden fury in his voice as he turned upon Robert, as if he could have indeed felled his wife's accuser to the earth with the strength of his uplifted arm. But my lady fell upon her knees at his feet, interposing herself between the baronet and his nephew, who stood leaning on the back of an easy-chair, with his face hidden by his hand. "He has told you the truth," said my lady, "and he is not mad. I have sent him for you that I may confess everything to you. I should be sorry for you if I could, for you have been very, very good to me, much better to me than I ever deserved. But I can't. I can't. I can feel nothing but my own misery. I told you long ago that I was selfish. I am selfish still, more selfish than ever in my misery. Happy, prosperous people may feel for others. I laugh at other people's sufferings. They seem so small compared to my own." When first my lady had fallen on her knees, Sir Michael had attempted to raise her, and had remonstrated with her, but as she spoke he dropped into a chair close to the spot upon which she knelt, and with his hands clasped together, and with his head bent to catch every syllable of those horrible words, he listened as if his whole being had been resolved into that one sense of hearing. "I must tell you the story of my life, in order to tell you why I have become the miserable wretch who has no better hope than to be allowed to run away and hide in some desolate corner of the earth. I must tell you the story of my life," repeated my lady, "but you need not fear that I shall dwell long upon it. It has not been so pleasant to me that I should wish to remember it. When I was a very little child, I remember asking a question which it was natural enough that I should ask, God help me. I asked where my mother was. I had a faint remembrance of a face, like what my own is now, looking at me when I was very little better than a baby, but I had missed the face suddenly, and had never seen it since. They told me that mother was away. I was not happy, for the woman who had charge of me was a disagreeable woman, and the place in which we lived was a lonely place, a village upon the Hampshire coast, about 7 miles from Portsmouth. My father, who was in the navy, only came now and then to see me, and I was left almost entirely to the charge of this woman, who was irregularly paid, and who vented her rage upon me when my father was behindhand in remitting her money. So you see that at a very early age I found out what it was to be poor. Perhaps it was more from being discontented with my dreary life than from any wonderful impulse of affection that I asked very often the same question about my mother. I always received the same answer. She was away. When I asked where, I was told that that was a secret. When I grew old enough to understand the meaning of the word death, I asked if my mother was dead, and I was told, no, she was not dead. She was ill, and she was away. I asked how long she had been ill, and I was told that she had been so some years, ever since I was a baby. At last the secret came out. I worried my foster mother with the old question one day when the remittances had fallen very much in arrear, and her temper had been unusually tried. She flew into a passion, and told me that my mother was a madwoman, and that she was in a madhouse 40 miles away. She had scarcely said this when she repented, and told me that it was not the truth, and that I was not to believe it, or to say that she had told me such a thing. I discovered afterward that my father had made her promise most solemnly never to tell me the secret of my mother's fate. I brooded horribly upon the thought of my mother's madness. It haunted me by day and night. I was always picturing to myself this madwoman pacing up and down some prison cell, in a hideous garment that bound her tortured limbs. I had exaggerated ideas of the horror of her situation. I had no knowledge of the different degrees of madness, and the image that haunted me was that of a distraught and violent creature who would fall upon me and kill me if I came within her reach. This idea grew upon me until I used to awake in the dead of night, screaming aloud in an agony of terror, from a dream in which I had felt my mother's icy grasp upon my throat and heard her ravings in my ear. When I was 10 years old, my father came to pay up the arrears due to my protectress, and to take me to school. He had left me in Hampshire longer than he had intended, from his inability to pay this money. So there again I felt the bitterness of poverty, and ran the risk of growing up an ignorant creature among coarse, rustic children, because my father was poor. My lady paused for a moment, but only to take breath, for she had spoken rapidly, as if eager to tell this hated story, and to have done with it. She was still on her knees, but Sir Michael made no effort to raise her. He sat silent and immovable. What was this story that he was listening to? Whose was it, and to what was it to lead? It could not be his wife's. He had heard her simple account of her youth, and had believed it as he had believed in the gospel. She had told him a very brief story of an early orphanage, and a long, quiet, colourless youth spent in the conventional seclusion of an English boarding school. My father came at last, and I told him what I had discovered. He was very much affected when I spoke of my mother. He was not what the world generally calls a good man, but I learned afterward that he had loved his wife very dearly, and that he would have willingly sacrificed his life to her, and constituted himself her guardian, had he not been compelled to earn the daily bread of the madwoman and her child by the exercise of his profession. So here again I beheld what a bitter thing it is to be poor. My mother, who might have been tended by a devoted husband, was given over to the care of hired nurses. Before my father sent me to school at Torquay, he took me to see my mother. This visit served at least to dispel the idea which had so often terrified me. I saw no raving, strait-waistcoated maniac, guarded by zealous jailers, but a golden-haired, blue-eyed, girlish creature, who seemed as frivolous as a butterfly, and who skipped toward us with her yellow curls decorated with natural flowers, and saluted us with radiant smiles and gay, ceaseless chatter. But she didn't know us. She would have spoken in the same manner to any stranger who had entered the gates of the garden about her prison house. Her madness was an hereditary disease transmitted to her from her mother, who had died mad. She, my mother, had been, or had appeared sane up to the hour of my birth, but from that hour her intellect had decayed, and she had become what I saw her. I went away with the knowledge of this, and with the knowledge that the only inheritance I had to expect from my mother was insanity. I went away with this knowledge in my mind, and with something more, a secret to keep. I was a child of 10 years only, but I felt all the weight of that burden. I was to keep the secret of my mother's madness, for it was a secret that might affect me injuriously in after life. I was to remember this. I did remember this, and it was perhaps this that made me selfish and heartless, for I suppose I am heartless. As I grew older I was told that I was pretty, beautiful, lovely, bewitching. I heard all these things at first indifferently, but by and by I listened to them greedily, and began to think that in spite of the secret of my life, I might be more successful in the world's great lottery than my companions. I had learnt that which in some indefinite manner or other every schoolgirl learns sooner or later. I learned that my ultimate fate in life depended upon my marriage, and I concluded that if I was indeed prettier than my schoolfellows, I ought to marry better than any one of them. I left school before I was 17 years of age, with this thought in my mind, and I went to live at the other extremity of England with my father, who had retired upon his half-pay, and had established himself at Wildernsea, with the idea that the place was cheap and select. The place was indeed select. I had not been there a month before I discovered that even the prettiest girl might wait a long time for a rich husband. I wished to hurry over this part of my life. I dare say I was very despicable. You and your nephew, Sir Michael, have been rich all your lives, and can very well afford to despise me, but I knew how far poverty can affect a life, and I looked forward with a sickening dread to a life so affected. At last the rich suitor, the wandering prince, came." She paused for a moment, and shuddered convulsively. It was impossible to see any of the changes in her countenance, for her face was obstinately bent toward the floor. Throughout her long confession she never lifted it. Throughout her long confession her voice was never broken by a tear. What she had to tell she told in a cold, hard tone, very much the tone in which some criminal, dogged and sullen to the last, might have confessed to a jail chaplain. "The wandering prince came," she repeated. "He was called George Talboys." For the first time since his wife's confession had begun, Sir Michael Audley started. He began to understand it all now. A crowd of unheeded words and forgotten circumstances, that had seemed too insignificant for remark or recollection, flashed back upon him as vividly as if they had been the leading incidents of his past life. Mr. George Talboys was a cornet in a dragoon regiment. He was the only son of a rich country gentleman. He fell in love with me, and married me 3 months after my 17th birthday. I think I loved him as much as it was in my power to love anybody. Not more than I have loved you, Sir Michael. Not so much, for when you married me, you elevated me to a position that he could never have given me. The dream was broken. Sir Michael Audley remembered that summer's evening, nearly 2 years ago, when he had first declared his love for Mr. Dawson's governess. He remembered the sick, half-shuddering sensation of regret and disappointment that had come over him then, and he felt as if it had in some manner dimly foreshadowed the agony of tonight. But I do not believe that even in his misery he felt that entire and unmitigated surprise, that utter revulsion of feeling that is felt when a good woman wanders away from herself and becomes the lost creature whom her husband is bound in honor to abjure. I do not believe that Sir Michael Audley had ever really believed in his wife. He had loved her and admired her. He had been bewitched by her beauty and bewildered by her charms, but that sense of something wanting, that vague feeling of loss and disappointment which had come upon him on the summer's night of his betrothal, had been with him more or less distinctly ever since. I cannot believe that an honest man, however pure and single may be his mind, however simply trustful his nature, is ever really deceived by falsehood. There is beneath the voluntary confidence an involuntary distrust, not to be conquered by any effort of the will. "We were married," my lady continued, "and I loved him very well, quite well enough to be happy with him as long as his money lasted, and while we were on the Continent, traveling in the best style, and always staying at the best hotels. But when we came back to Wildernsea and lived with papa, and all the money was gone, and George grew gloomy and wretched, and was always thinking of his troubles, and appeared to neglect me, I was very unhappy, and it seemed as if this fine marriage had only given me a 12-month's gaiety and extravagance after all. I begged George to appeal to his father, but he refused. I persuaded him to try and get employment, and he failed. My baby was born, and the crisis which had been fatal to my mother arose for me. I escaped, but I was more irritable perhaps after my recovery, less inclined to fight the hard battle of the world, more disposed to complain of poverty and neglect. I did complain one day, loudly and bitterly. I upbraided George Talboys for his cruelty in having allied a helpless girl to poverty and misery, and he flew into a passion with me and ran out of the house. When I awoke the next morning, I found a letter lying on the table by my bed, telling me that he was going to the Antipodes to seek his fortune, and that he would never see me again until he was a rich man. I looked upon this as a desertion, and I resented it bitterly, resented it by hating the man who had left me with no protector but a weak, tipsy father, and with a child to support. I had to work hard for my living, and in every hour of labor, and what labor is more wearisome than the dull slavery of a governess? I recognized a separate wrong done me by George Talboys. His father was rich, his sister was living in luxury and respectability, and I, his wife, and the mother of his son, was a slave allied to beggary and obscurity. People pitied me, and I hated them for their pity. I did not love the child, for he had been left a burden upon my hands. The hereditary taint that was in my blood had never until this time showed itself by any one sign or token. But at this time I became subject to fits of violence and despair. At this time I think my mind first lost its balance, and for the first time I crossed that invisible line which separates reason from madness. I have seen my father's eyes fixed upon me in horror and alarm. I have known him soothe me as only mad people and children are soothed, and I have chafed against his petty devices. I have resented even his indulgence. At last these fits of desperation resolved themselves into a desperate purpose. I determined to run away from this wretched home which my slavery supported. I determined to desert this father who had more fear of me than love for me. I determined to go to London and lose myself in that great chaos of humanity. I had seen an advertisement in the Times while I was at Wildernsea, and I presented myself to Mrs. Vincent, the advertiser, under a feigned name. She accepted me, waiving all questions as to my antecedents. You know the rest. I came here, and you made me an offer, the acceptance of which would lift me at once into the sphere to which my ambition had pointed ever since I was a schoolgirl, and heard for the first time that I was pretty. 3 years had passed, and I had received no token of my husband's existence. For, I argued, that if he had returned to England, he would have succeeded in finding me under any name and in any place. I knew the energy of his character well enough to know this. I said, I have a right to think that he is dead, or that he wishes me to believe him dead, and his shadow shall not stand between me and prosperity. I said this, and I became your wife, Sir Michael, with every resolution to be as good a wife as it was in my nature to be. The common temptations that assail and shipwreck some women had no terror for me. I would have been your true and pure wife to the end of time, though I had been surrounded by a legion of tempters. The mad folly that the world calls love had never had any part in my madness, and here at least extremes met, and the vice of heartlessness became the virtue of constancy. I was very happy in the first triumph and grandeur of my new position, very grateful to the hand that had lifted me to it. In the sunshine of mine own happiness I felt, for the first time in my life, for the miseries of others. I had been poor myself, and I was now rich, and could afford to pity and relieve the poverty of my neighbors. I took pleasure in acts of kindness and benevolence. I found out my father's address, and sent him large sums of money anonymously, for I did not wish him to discover what had become of me. I availed myself to the full of the privilege your generosity afforded me. I dispensed happiness on every side. I saw myself loved as well as admired, and I think I might have been a good woman for the rest of my life, if fate would have allowed me to be so. I believe that at this time my mind regained its just balance. I had watched myself very closely since leaving Wildernsea. I had held a check upon myself. I had often wondered while sitting in the surgeon's quiet family circle whether any suspicion of that invisible hereditary taint had ever occurred to Mr. Dawson. Fate would not suffer me to be good. My destiny compelled me to be a wretch. Within a month of my marriage, I read in one of the Essex papers of the return of a certain Mr. Talboys, a fortunate gold-seeker from Australia. The ship had sailed at the time I read the paragraph. What was to be done? I said just now that I knew the energy of George's character. I knew that the man who had gone to the Antipodes and won a fortune for his wife would leave no stone unturned in his efforts to find her. It was hopeless to think of hiding myself from him. Unless he could be induced to believe that I was dead, he would never cease in his search for me. My brain was dazed as I thought of my peril. Again the balance trembled. Again the invisible boundary was passed. Again I was mad. I went down to Southampton and found my father, who was living there with my child. You remember how Mrs. Vincent's name was used as an excuse for this hurried journey, and how it was contrived I should go with no other escort than Phoebe Marks, whom I left at the hotel while I went to my father's house. I confided to my father the whole secret of my peril. He was not very much shocked at what I had done, for poverty had perhaps blunted his sense of honor and principle. He was not very much shocked, but he was frightened, and he promised to do all in his power to assist me in my horrible emergency. He had received a letter addressed to me at Wildernsea by George, and forwarded from there to my father. This letter had been written within a few days of the sailing of the Argus, and it announced the probable date of the ship's arrival at Liverpool. This letter gave us, therefore, data upon which to act. We decided at once upon the first step. This was that on the date of the probable arrival of the Argus, or a few days later, an advertisement of my death should be inserted in the Times. But almost immediately after deciding upon this, we saw that there were fearful difficulties in the carrying out of such a simple plan. The date of the death, and the place in which I died, must be announced, as well as the death itself. George would immediately hurry to that place, however distant it might be, however comparatively inaccessible, and the shallow falsehood would be discovered. I knew enough of his sanguine temperament, his courage and determination, his readiness to hope against hope, to know that unless he saw the grave in which I was buried, and the register of my death, he would never believe that I was lost to him. My father was utterly dumbfounded and helpless. He could only shed childish tears of despair and terror. He was of no use to me in this crisis. I was hopeless of any issue out of my difficulties. I began to think that I must trust to the chapter of accidents, and hope that among other obscure corners of the earth, Audley Court might be undreamt of by my husband. I sat with my father, drinking tea with him in his miserable hovel, and playing with the child, who was pleased with my dress and jewels, but quite unconscious that I was anything but a stranger to him. I had the boy in my arms, when a woman who attended him came to fetch him that she might make him more fit to be seen by the lady, as she said. I was anxious to know how the boy was treated, and I detained this woman in conversation with me while my father dozed over the tea-table. She was a pale-faced, sandy-haired woman of about 45, and she seemed very glad to get the chance of talking to me as long as I pleased to allow her. She soon left off talking of the boy, however, to tell me of her own troubles. She was in very great trouble, she told me. Her eldest daughter had been obliged to leave her situation from ill health. In fact, the doctor said the girl was in a decline, and it was a hard thing for a poor widow who had seen better days to have a sick daughter to support, as well as a family of young children. I let the woman run on for a long time in this manner, telling me the girl's ailments, and the girl's age, and the girl's doctor's stuff, and piety, and sufferings, and a great deal more. But I neither listened to her nor heeded her. I heard her, but only in a far-away manner, as I heard the traffic in the street, or the ripple of the stream at the bottom of it. What were this woman's troubles to me? I had miseries of my own, and worse miseries than her coarse nature could ever have to endure. These sort of people always had sick husbands, or sick children, and expected to be helped in their illness by the rich. It was nothing out of the common. I was thinking this, and I was just going to dismiss the woman with a sovereign for her sick daughter, when an idea flashed upon me with such painful suddenness that it sent the blood surging up to my brain and set my heart beating, as it only beats when I am mad. I asked the woman her name. She was a Mrs. Plowson, and she kept a small general shop, she said, and only ran in now and then to look after Georgie, and to see that the little maid-of-all-work took care of him. Her daughter's name was Matilda. I asked her several questions about this girl Matilda, and I ascertained that she was 24, that she had always been a consumptive, and that she was now, as the doctor said, going off in a rapid decline. He had declared that she could not last much more than a fortnight. It was in 3 weeks that the ship that carried George Talboys was expected to anchor in the Mersey. I need not dwell upon this business. I visited the sick girl. She was fair and slender. Her description, carelessly given, might tally nearly enough with my own, though she bore no shadow of resemblance to me, except in these 2 particulars. I was received by the girl as a rich lady who wished to do her a service. I bought the mother, who was poor and greedy, and who for a gift of money, more money than she had ever before received, consented to submit to anything I wished. Upon the 2nd day after my introduction to this Mrs. Plowson, my father went over to Ventnor, and hired lodgings for his invalid daughter and her little boy. Early the next morning he carried over the dying girl and Georgie, who had been bribed to call her Mamma. She entered the house as Mrs. Talboys. She was attended by a Ventnor medical man as Mrs. Talboys. She died, and her death and burial were registered in that name. The advertisement was inserted in the Times, and upon the 2nd day after its insertion, George Talboys visited Ventnor, and ordered the tombstone which at this hour records the death of his wife, Helen Talboys. Sir Michael Audley rose slowly, and with a stiff, constrained action, as if every physical sense had been benumbed by that one sense of misery.
"I cannot hear any more," he said in a hoarse whisper. "If there is anything more to be told, I cannot hear it. Robert, it is you who have brought about this discovery, as I understand. I want to know nothing more. Will you take upon yourself the duty of providing for the safety and comfort of this lady whom I have thought my wife? I need not ask you to remember in all that you do that I have loved her very dearly and truly. I cannot say farewell to her. I will not say it until I can think of her without bitterness, until I can pity her, as I now pray that God may pity her this night."
Sir Michael walked slowly from the room. He did not trust himself to look at that crouching figure. He did not wish to see the creature whom he had cherished. He went straight to his dressing-room, rung for his valet, and ordered him to pack a portmanteau, and make all necessary arrangements for accompanying his master by the last up train. Chapter 35. The Hush That Succeeds the Tempest. Robert Audley followed his uncle into the vestibule after Sir Michael had spoken those few quiet words which sounded the death-knell of his hope and love. Heaven knows how much the young man had feared the coming of this day. It had come, and though there had been no great outburst of despair, no whirlwind of stormy grief, no loud tempest of anguish and tears, Robert took no comforting thought from the unnatural stillness. He knew enough to know that Sir Michael Audley went away with the barbed arrow which his nephew's hand had sent home to its aim, rankling in his tortured heart. He knew that this strange and icy calm was the first numbness of a heart stricken by grief, so unexpected as for a time to be rendered almost incomprehensible by a blank stupor of astonishment. He knew that when this dull quiet had passed away, when little by little, and one by one, each horrible feature of the sufferer's sorrow became first dimly apparent and then terribly familiar to him, the storm would burst in fatal fury, and tempests of tears and cruel thunderclaps of agony would rend that generous heart. Robert had heard of cases in which men of his uncle's age had borne some great grief, as Sir Michael had borne this, with a strange quiet, and had gone away from those who would have comforted them, and whose anxieties had been relieved by this patient stillness, to fall down upon the ground and die under the blow which at first had only stunned him. He remembered cases in which paralysis and apoplexy had stricken men as strong as his uncle in the first hour of the horrible affliction, and he lingered in the lamp-lit vestibule, wondering whether it was not his duty to be with Sir Michael, to be near him in case of any emergency, and to accompany him wherever he went. Yet would it be wise to force himself upon that grey-headed sufferer in this cruel hour, in which he had been awakened from the one delusion of a blameless life, to discover that he had been the dupe of a false face, and the fool of a nature which was too coldly mercenary, too cruelly heartless, to be sensible of its own infamy? "No," thought Robert Audley, "I will not intrude upon the anguish of this wounded heart. There is humiliation mingled with this bitter grief. It is better he should fight the battle alone. I have done what I believe to have been my solemn duty, yet I should scarcely wonder if I had rendered myself forever hateful to him. It is better he should fight the battle alone. I can do nothing to make the strife less terrible. Better that it should be fought alone." While the young man stood with his hand upon the library door, still half doubtful whether he should follow his uncle, or re-enter the room in which he had left that more wretched creature whom it had been his business to unmask, Alicia Audley opened the dining-room door, and revealed to him the old-fashioned oak-panelled apartment, the long table covered with a showy damask, and bright with a cheerful glitter of glass and silver. "Is papa coming to dinner?" asked Miss Audley. "I'm so hungry, and poor Tomlins has sent up 3 times to say the fish will be spoiled. It must be reduced to a species of isinglass soup by this time, I should think," added the young lady, as she came out into the vestibule with the Times newspaper in her hand. She had been sitting by the fire reading the paper, and waiting for her seniors to join her at the dinner-table. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Robert Audley," she remarked indifferently. "You dine with us, of course. Pray go and find papa. It must be nearly 8 o'clock, and we are supposed to dine at 6." Mr. Audley answered his cousin rather sternly. Her frivolous manner jarred upon him, and he forgot in his irrational displeasure that Miss Audley had known nothing of the terrible drama which had been so long enacting under her very nose. "Your papa has just endured a very great grief, Alicia," the young man said gravely. The girl's arch, laughing face changed in a moment to a tenderly earnest look of sorrow and anxiety. Alicia Audley loved her father very dearly. "A grief!" she exclaimed. "Papa grieved! Oh, Robert, what has happened?"
"I can tell you nothing yet, Alicia," Robert answered in a low voice.
He took his cousin by the wrist and drew her into the dining room as he spoke. He closed the door carefully behind him before he continued.
"Alicia, can I trust you?" he asked earnestly.
"Trust me to do what?"
"To be a comfort and a friend to your poor father under a very heavy affliction."
"Yes!" cried Alicia passionately. "How can you ask me such a question? Do you think there is anything I would not do to lighten any sorrow of my father's? Do you think there is anything I would not suffer if my suffering could lighten his?" The rushing tears rose to Miss Audley's bright gray eyes as she spoke. "Oh, Robert, Robert, could you think so badly of me as to think I would not try to be a comfort to my father in his grief?" she said reproachfully.
"No, no, my dear," answered the young man quietly. "I never doubted your affection. I only doubted your discretion. May I rely upon that?"
"You may, Robert," said Alicia resolutely.
"Very well, then, my dear girl, I will trust you. Your father is going to leave the court, for a time at least. The grief which he has just endured, a sudden and unlooked-for sorrow, remember, has no doubt made this place hateful to him. He is going away, but he must not go alone, must he, Alicia?"
"Alone? No, no! But I suppose my lady—"
"Lady Audley will not go with him," said Robert gravely. "He is about to separate himself from her."
"For a time?"
"No, forever."
"Separate himself from her forever!" exclaimed Alicia. "Then this grief—"
"Is connected with Lady Audley. Lady Audley is the cause of your father's sorrow."
Alicia's face, which had been pale before, flushed crimson. Sorrow of which my lady was the cause, a sorrow which was to separate Sir Michael forever from his wife. There had been no quarrel between them. There had never been anything but harmony and sunshine between Lady Audley and her generous husband. This sorrow must surely then have arisen from some sudden discovery. It was, no doubt, a sorrow associated with disgrace. Robert Audley understood the meaning of that vivid blush.
"You will offer to accompany your father wherever he may choose to go, Alicia," he said. "You are his natural comforter at such a time as this, but you will best befriend him in this hour of trial by avoiding all intrusion upon his grief. Your very ignorance of the particulars of that grief will be a security for your discretion. Say nothing to your father that you might not have said to him 2 years ago, before he married a second wife. Try and be to him what you were before the woman in yonder room came between you and your father's love."
"I will," murmured Alicia. "I will."
"You will naturally avoid all mention of Lady Audley's name. If your father is often silent, be patient. If it sometimes seems to you that the shadow of this great sorrow will never pass away from his life, be patient still. And remember that there can be no better hope of a cure of his grief than the hope that his daughter's devotion may lead him to remember there is one woman upon this earth who will love him truly and purely until the last."
"Yes, yes, Robert, dear cousin, I will remember." Mr. Audley, for the first time since he had been a schoolboy, took his cousin in his arms and kissed her broad forehead.
"My dear Alicia," he said, "do this, and you will make me happy. I have been in some measure the means of bringing this sorrow upon your father. Let me hope that it is not an enduring one. Try and restore my uncle to happiness, Alicia, and I will love you more dearly than brother ever loved a noble-hearted sister, and a brotherly affection may be worth having, perhaps, after all, my dear, though it is very different to poor Sir Harry's enthusiastic worship."
Alicia's head was bent and her face hidden from her cousin while he spoke, but she lifted her head when he had finished, and looked him full in the face with a smile that was only the brighter for her eyes being filled with tears. "You are a good fellow, Bob," she said, "and I've been very foolish and wicked to feel angry with you because—" The young lady stopped suddenly.
"Because what, my dear?" asked Mr. Audley.
"Because I'm silly, Cousin Robert," Alicia said quickly. "Never mind that, Bob. I'll do all you wish, and it shall not be my fault if my dearest father doesn't forget his troubles before long. I'd go to the end of the world with him, poor darling, if I thought there was any comfort to be found for him in the journey. I'll go and get ready directly. Do you think papa will go tonight?"
"Yes, my dear. I don't think Sir Michael will rest another night under this roof yet awhile."
"The mail goes at 20 minutes past 9," said Alicia. "We must leave the house in an hour if we are to travel by it. I shall see you again before we go, Robert."
"Yes, dear."
Miss Audley ran off to her room to summon her maid, and make all necessary preparations for the sudden journey, of whose ultimate destination she was as yet quite ignorant. She went heart and soul into the carrying out of the duty which Robert had dictated to her. She assisted in the packing of her portmanteaus, and hopelessly bewildered her maid by stuffing silk dresses into her bonnet boxes and satin shoes into her dressing case. She roamed about her rooms, gathering together drawing materials, music books, needlework, hairbrushes, jewelry, and perfume bottles, very much as she might have done had she been about to sail for some savage country, devoid of all civilized resources. She was thinking all the time of her father's unknown grief, and perhaps a little of the serious face and earnest voice which she had that night revealed her cousin Robert to her in a new character. Mr. Audley went upstairs after his cousin, and found his way to Sir Michael's dressing-room. He knocked at the door and listened, heaven knows how anxiously, for the expected answer. There was a moment's pause, during which the young man's heart beat loud and fast, and then the door was opened by the baronet himself. Robert saw that his uncle's valet was already hard at work preparing for his master's hurried journey. Sir Michael came out into the corridor. "Have you anything more to say to me, Robert?" he asked quietly. "I only came to ascertain if I could assist in any of your arrangements. You go to London by the mail?" "Yes." "Have you any idea of where you will stay?" "Yes. I shall stop at the Clarendon. I am known there. Is that all you have to say?" "Yes, except that Alicia will accompany you." "Alicia?" "She could not very well stay here, you know, just now. It would be best for her to leave the court until—" "Yes, I understand," interrupted the baronet. "But is there nowhere else that she could go? Must she be with me?" "She could go nowhere else so immediately, and she would not be happy anywhere else." "Let her come, then," said Sir Michael. "Let her come." He spoke in a strange, subdued voice, and with an apparent effort, as if it were painful to him to have to speak at all, as if all this ordinary business of life were a cruel torture to him, and jarred so much upon his grief as to be almost worse to bear than that grief itself. "Very well, my dear uncle, then it is all arranged. Alicia will be ready to start at 9 o'clock." "Very good, very good," muttered the baronet. "Let her come if she pleases, poor child. Let her come." He sighed heavily as he spoke in that half-pitying tone of his daughter. He was thinking how comparatively indifferent he had been toward that only child for the sake of the woman now shut in the firelit room below. "I shall see you again before you go, sir," said Robert. "I will leave you till then." "Stay," said Sir Michael suddenly. "Have you told Alicia?" "I have told her nothing, except that you are about to leave the court for some time." "You are very good, my boy. You are very good," the baronet murmured in a broken voice. He stretched out his hand. His nephew took it in both his own, and pressed it to his lips. "Oh, sir, how can I ever forgive myself?" he said. "How can I ever cease to hate myself for having brought this grief upon you?" "No, Robert, you did right. I wish that God had been so merciful to me as to take my miserable life before this night, but you did right." Sir Michael re-entered his dressing-room, and Robert slowly returned to the vestibule. He paused upon the threshold of that chamber in which he had left Lucy, Lady Audley, otherwise Helen Talboys, the wife of his lost friend. She was lying upon the floor, upon the very spot in which she had crouched at her husband's feet telling her guilty story. Whether she was in a swoon, or whether she lay there in the utter helplessness of her misery, Robert scarcely cared to know. He went out into the vestibule, and sent one of the servants to look for her maid, the smart, beribboned damsel who was loud in wonder and consternation at the sight of her mistress. "Lady Audley is very ill," he said. "Take her to her room and see that she does not leave it tonight. You will be good enough to remain near her, but do not either talk to her or suffer her to excite herself by talking." My lady had not fainted. She allowed the girl to assist her, and rose from the ground upon which she had grovelled. Her golden hair fell in loose, dishevelled masses about her ivory throat and shoulders, and her face and lips were colourless, her eyes terrible in their unnatural light. "Take me away," she said, "and let me sleep. Let me sleep, for my brain is on fire." As she was leaving the room with her maid, she turned and looked at Robert. "Is Sir Michael gone?" she asked. "He will leave in half an hour." "There were no lives lost in the fire at Mount Stanning?" "None." "I am glad of that." "The landlord of the house, Marks, was very terribly burned, and lies in a precarious state at his mother's cottage, but he may recover." "I am glad of that. I am glad no life was lost. Good night, Mr. Audley."
"I shall ask to see you for a half an hour's conversation in the course of tomorrow, my lady."
"Whenever you please. Good night."
"Good night."
She went away quietly leaning upon her maid's shoulder, and leaving Robert with a sense of strange bewilderment that was very painful to him. He sat down by the broad hearth upon which the red embers were fading, and wondered at the change in that old house, which, until the day of his friend's disappearance, had been so pleasant a home for all who sheltered beneath its hospitable roof. He sat brooding over the desolate hearth, and trying to decide upon what must be done in this sudden crisis. He sat helpless and powerless to determine upon any course of action, lost in a dull reverie, from which he was aroused by the sound of carriage wheels driving up to the little turret entrance. The clock in the vestibule struck 9 as Robert opened the library door. Alicia had just descended the stairs with her maid, a rosy-faced country girl. "Good-bye, Robert," said Miss Audley, holding out her hand to her cousin. "Good-bye, and God bless you. You may trust me to take care of papa."
"I am sure I may. God bless you, my dear."
For the second time that night Robert Audley pressed his lips to his cousin's candid forehead, and for the second time the embrace was of a brotherly or paternal character, rather than the rapturous proceeding which it would have been had Sir Harry Towers been the privileged performer. It was 5 minutes past 9 when Sir Michael came downstairs, followed by his valet, grave and grey-haired like himself. The baronet was pale, but calm and self-possessed. The hand which he gave to his nephew was as cold as ice, but it was with a steady voice that he bade the young man good-bye.
"I leave all in your hands, Robert," he said, as he turned to leave the house in which he had lived so long. "I may not have heard the end, but I have heard enough. Heaven knows I have no need to hear more. I leave all to you, but you will not be cruel. You will remember how much I have loved—"
His voice broke huskily before he could finish the sentence.
"I will remember you in everything, sir," the young man answered. "I will do everything for the best."
A treacherous mist of tears blinded him and shut out his uncle's face, and in another minute the carriage had driven away, and Robert Audley sat alone in the dark library, where only one red spark glowed among the pale grey ashes. He sat alone, trying to think what he ought to do, and with the awful responsibility of a wicked woman's fate upon his shoulders.
"Good heaven," he thought, "surely this must be God's judgment upon the purposeless, vacillating life I led up to the 7th day of last September. Surely this awful responsibility has been forced upon me, in order that I may humble myself to an offended Providence, and confess that a man cannot choose his own life. He cannot say, 'I will take existence lightly, and keep out of the way of the wretched, mistaken, energetic creatures who fight so heartily in the great battle.' He cannot say, 'I will stop in the tents while the strife is fought, and laugh at the fools who are trampled down in the useless struggle.' He cannot do this. He can only do, humbly and fearfully, that which the Maker who created him has appointed for him to do. If he has a battle to fight, let him fight it faithfully. But woe betide him if he skulks when his name is called in the mighty muster-roll. Woe betide him if he hides in the tents when the tocsin summons him to the scene of war."
One of the servants brought candles into the library and relighted the fire, but Robert Audley did not stir from his seat by the hearth. He sat as he had often sat in his chambers at Fig-tree Court, with his elbows resting upon the arms of his chair and his chin upon his hand. But he lifted his head as the servant was about to leave the room.
"Can I send a message from here to London?" he asked.
"It can be sent from Brentwood, sir, not from here." Mr. Audley looked at his watch thoughtfully. "One of the men can ride over to Brentwood, sir, if you wish any message to be sent."
"I do wish to send a message. Will you manage it for me, Richards?"
"Certainly, sir."
"You can wait, then, while I write the message."
"Yes, sir." The man brought writing materials from one of the side tables, and placed them before Mr. Audley. Robert dipped a pen in the ink, and stared thoughtfully at one of the candles for a few moments before he began to write. The message ran thus:
"From Robert Audley, of Audley Court, Essex, to Francis Wilmington, of Paper Buildings, Temple. Dear Wilmington, if you know any physician experienced in cases of mania, and to be trusted with a secret, be so good as to send me his address by telegraph."
Mr. Audley sealed this document in a stout envelope, and handed it to the man with a sovereign.
"You will see that this is given to a trustworthy person, Richards," he said, "and let the man wait at the station for the return message. He ought to get it in an hour and a half."
Mr. Richards, who had known Robert Audley in jackets and turn-down collars, departed to execute his commission, Heaven forbid that we should follow him into the comfortable servants' hall at the Court, where the household sat round the blazing fire, discussing in utter bewilderment the events of the day. Nothing could be wider from the truth than the speculations of these worthy people. What clue had they to the mystery of that firelit room in which a guilty woman had knelt at their master's feet to tell the story of her sinful life? They only knew that which Sir Michael's valet had told them of his sudden journey, how his master was as pale as a sheet, and spoke in a strange voice that didn't sound like his own somehow, and how you might have knocked him, Mr. Parsons the valet, down with a feather if you had been minded to prostrate him by the aid of so feeble a weapon. The wise heads of the servants' hall decided that Sir Michael had received sudden intelligence through Mr. Robert. They were wise enough to connect the young man with the catastrophe, either of the death of some near and dear relation. The elder servants decimated the Audley family in their endeavors to find a likely relation, or of some alarming fall in the funds, or of the failure of some speculation or bank in which the greater part of the baronet's money was invested. The general leaning was toward the failure of a bank, and every member of the assembly seemed to take a dismal and raven-like delight in the fancy, though such a supposition involved their own ruin and the general destruction of that liberal household. Robert sat by the dreary hearth, which seemed dreary even now when the blaze of a great wood fire roared in the wide chimney, and listened to the low wail of the March wind moaning round the house and lifting the shivering ivy from the walls it sheltered. He was tired and worn out, for remember that he had been awakened from his sleep at 2 o'clock that morning by the hot breath of blazing timber and the sharp crackling of burning woodwork. But for his presence of mind and cool decision, Mr. Luke Marks would have died a dreadful death. He still bore the traces of the night's peril, for the dark hair had been singed upon one side of his forehead, and his left hand was red and inflamed, from the effect of the scorching atmosphere out of which he had dragged the landlord of the Castle Inn. He was thoroughly exhausted with fatigue and excitement, and he fell into a heavy sleep in his easy-chair before the bright fire, from which he was only awakened by the entrance of Mr. Richards with the return message. This return message was very brief. "Dear Audley, always glad to oblige. Alwyn Mosgrave, M.D., 12 Savile Row. Safe." This, with names and addresses, was all that it contained.
"I shall want another message taken to Brentwood tomorrow morning, Richards," said Mr. Audley as he folded the telegram. "I should be glad if the man would ride over with it before breakfast. He shall have half a sovereign for his trouble."
Mr. Richards bowed. "Thank you, sir. Not necessary, sir. But as you please, of course, sir," he murmured. "At what hour might you wish the man to go?" Mr. Audley might wish the man to go as early as he could, so it was decided that he should go at 6.
"My room is ready, I suppose, Richards?" said Robert.
"Yes, sir, your old room."
"Very good. I shall go to bed at once. Bring me a glass of brandy and water as hot as you can make it, and wait for the telegram."
This second message was only a very earnest request to Dr. Mosgrave to pay an immediate visit to Audley Court on a matter of serious moment. Having written this message, Mr. Audley felt that he had done all that he could do. He drank his brandy and water. He had actual need of the diluted alcohol, for he had been chilled to the bone by his adventures during the fire. He slowly sipped the pale golden liquid, and thought of Clara Talboys, of that earnest girl whose brother's memory was now avenged, whose brother's destroyer was humiliated in the dust. Had she heard of the fire at the Castle Inn? How could she have done otherwise than hear of it in such a place as Mount Stanning? But had she heard that he had been in danger, and that he had distinguished himself by the rescue of a drunken boor? I fear that, even sitting by that desolate hearth, and beneath the roof whose noble was an exile from his own house, Robert Audley was weak enough to think of these things, weak enough to let his fancy wander away to the dismal fir trees under the cold March sky, and the dark brown eyes that were so like the eyes of his lost friend.